My sister's hand closed around my daughter's breathing tube and ripped it free before I could reach the bed. The machines aren't saving her. They're only keeping her suffering alive. The ventilator alarm screamed. I lunged, but my mother twisted both my arms behind my back while 10-year-old Lark fought for air. The ICU team rushed in, as Odette stepped away from the bed. She thought the chaos would let her rename what she had done. The ventilator had already marked the exact second her version of mercy became evidence. Before I take you back to the 20 minutes that led to that alarm, I hope you are doing well wherever you are listening from. Stay with me and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss what Lark's 6 words uncovered. 20 minutes earlier, I had been sitting beside my daughter's bed with my phone face down beneath my palm. I had not opened our last text conversation since the ambulance brought her in. "Mom, can you get me instead?" That was all Lark had written at 3:42 on Wednesday afternoon. I had been in a records meeting at the Sacramento County Administrative Office, surrounded by permit files, deadlines, and 3 people arguing about a missing signature. I answered without asking why. "Grandma and Aunt Odette are already on their way. I'll see you at home." At 4:26, a highway patrol officer called to tell me there had been an accident. By the time I reached the hospital, Lark had been rushed into surgery with injuries to her chest, abdomen, and head. Odette told the police she had been driving when a black SUV forced them off the road. My mother, Corinne, repeated the same story with the calm certainty she used whenever she wanted a version of events to become permanent. For almost 2 days, I had believed them. Since Lark's father, Daniel, had died 6 years earlier, every medical decision rested with me alone. There was no second parent on the way to take over when I could no longer think clearly. I kept Lark's phone and backpack under the chair beside me. The corner of her sound map notebook stuck through the half-open zipper. She loved recording ordinary places by sound. A bus break became 3 gray lines. A crosswalk signal became yellow squares. My townhouse kitchen was a blue circle for the refrigerator hum, 2 small red marks for the coffee maker, and a crooked green line for my footsteps when I came home from work. The page she had been drawing before the accident was still unfinished. At the top, in her careful block letters, she had written Grandma's car. There were marks for the turn signal, the air conditioner, the click of a seatbelt, and the 3-note warning chime the car made when a door was not fully closed. A pencil line ended halfway across the paper. I touched it once, then pulled my hand back. The ventilator breathed for her with a measured hiss. Every few seconds, the monitor cast green light across her face. Bruising darkened one side of her forehead. Tape held the breathing tube against her cheek. A line disappeared beneath the blanket near her wrist, and another ran toward the monitors above her bed. I had learned to read the room through numbers. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, blood pressure, intracranial pressure. Numbers were easier than questions. My mother entered carrying a paper bag and a cup of coffee I had not requested. "You need food," Corinne said. "I need her awake. You will be no use to her if you collapse." She set the bag on the counter, as if she were arranging lunch during one of our old family meetings. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the back of her head. She wore the same beige coat she had worn when I arrived at the hospital. There was not a wrinkle in it. Odette followed her into the room, but stopped near the foot of the bed. My sister was 3 years older than me, yet beside our mother she always seemed younger. Corinne answered questions for her, corrected her memories, and explained her mistakes before anyone could name them. Odette had spent her life accepting that protection and calling it love. That afternoon, she looked exhausted. Her hair had been pulled into a loose knot, and there was a small bruise near her collarbone from the accident. She kept one hand wrapped around the strap of her handbag. She did not look at Lark's face. Dr. Syra Nadim came in with a respiratory therapist and checked the numbers before speaking to me. Her voice was quiet, exact, and free of promises. "The swelling has remained stable," she said. "Her latest neurological checks are encouraging. We are reducing the sedation slowly." I stood so quickly the chair legs scraped the floor. Does that mean she's waking up? It means she may begin to wake tonight. We need to see how she responds. She may open her eyes. She may follow simple commands. Recovery after this kind of trauma is not predictable. Will she be in pain? We will manage her pain while allowing enough awareness for us to assess her. Can she move? We do not know yet. I heard myself asking question after question, trying to build a bridge out of every careful answer. Then Odette spoke. If she wakes up, will she remember what happened before the crash? The room became still, in a way the monitors could not measure. Dr. Nadim turned toward her. Memory after a head injury varies. She may remember events clearly, in fragments, or not at all. We will not know until she is able to respond. Odette's fingers tightened around her handbag strap. Corinne moved before I could speak. She's asking because she feels guilty, Mom said. She was driving. Of course she wants to know whether Lark remembers being frightened. Dr. Nadim looked back at me. For now, no one should question Lark about the accident. Let the medical team assess her first. I understand. The doctor checked the tube placement and reminded all three of us not to touch any equipment. The respiratory therapist repeated the warning before they left. The glass door closed behind them. For a few seconds, only the ventilator spoke. Corinne picked up the paper bag. Marin, go wash your face. Eat something in the family room. I'm staying here. You have been sitting in that chair for nearly 48 hours. And I'm staying here. Her mouth tightened. It was the expression she used whenever someone mistook one of her instructions for a suggestion. Odette glanced toward the glass wall, then at the clock above the door. I noticed because she did it again. She looked toward the nurse's station, at the empty stretch of hall, then back at Lark. I stood between her and the bed without meaning to. What did the SUV look like? I asked. Odette blinked. What? The vehicle that forced you off the road. Black. Large. You told the officer. It came from the left. It did. Yesterday you said it came up behind you. Her face changed for less than a second. It came from behind and moved to the left, she said. I was trying not to hit it. Everything happened fast. Corinne exhaled sharply. Is this necessary? I'm asking one question. Odette almost died too. I know that. Then stop making her relive it because you need someone to blame. I looked at my sister. I didn't say I blamed anyone. No, Odette said. You just keep asking like you think I'm lying. The words came too quickly. Corinne stepped closer to her. Nobody said that. They looked at each other, and something passed between them that did not belong to grief. It was not comfort. It was coordination. Lark's monitor changed rhythm, and all three of us turned toward the bed. Her eyelids fluttered once, then settled. One finger shifted against the sheet. I moved closer. Lark? Odette's breathing changed. My mother caught her wrist, not hard enough to look like restraint, but hard enough that I saw it. Let the doctors handle this, Corinne said. I pressed the call button. Before anyone answered, Lark's eyelids moved again. Her brow tightened around the tape at her temple. I whispered her name and told her I was there. Odette stepped toward the head of the bed. What are you doing? I asked. Her hair is caught. It isn't. She reached as if to smooth Lark's hair away from the tape. Her fingers moved past the strands and closed around the tube holder, fixed against my daughter's cheek. For one frozen second, I thought she was confused. Then she tore the fastener loose. The tube came out with a wet, violent pull. The ventilator alarm exploded through the room. Lark's body jerked. Her mouth opened, but the sound that came out was raw and broken. She tried to draw in air, her chest lifting without a stable breath. Odette stood over her. The machines aren't saving her. They're only keeping her suffering alive. I lunged. My mother caught me from behind and wrenched both arms back. Pain shot through my shoulders. Let me go. Stop fighting, Corinne said into my ear. My child can't breathe. The staff will handle it. The call button. I tried to twist free, but she locked my wrists together and pulled me farther from the bed. I could see Lark's eyes open through the movement, unfocused and terrified. Her fingers clawed weakly at the blanket. Odette did not reach for the call button. She watched. I screamed for help until my throat burned. The door flew open. A nurse rushed in, followed by the respiratory therapist and Dr. Nadim. Corinne released me the instant they crossed the threshold. I stumbled into the wall. The team surrounded Lark. Someone lifted a bag mask over her face. Another person pushed Odette away from the bed. Dr. Nadim called for medication and a new tube. "What happened?" the charge nurse demanded. "She pulled it out," Odette said, pointing at Lark. "She started waking up. I tried to stop her. I stared at her." "You ripped it out?" Odette began to cry. "I was trying to hold it in place. You said the machines were making her suffer." I panicked. My mother stepped between us. "Marin, you're confused. You were screaming before anyone knew what happened." She held my arms. Corinne looked at the nurse as though I had accused her of something embarrassing rather than monstrous. I kept her from interfering with the medical team. "There was no medical team in the room when you grabbed me." Security arrived before she could answer. The charge nurse ordered all three of us into the hall while the team worked. I refused to leave until Dr. Nadim looked directly at me and said they needed space to secure Lark's airway. The door closed between us. Through the glass, I watched them place another tube. I saw Lark's chest begin to rise in a controlled rhythm again. My knees weakened, but I stayed upright. A social worker came down the hall with 2 security officers. She separated Odette and Corinne into different waiting rooms. Neither was allowed back into the unit. Odette kept crying. "It was an accident. I was trying to help." Corinne spoke over her. "My daughter is traumatized." Marin misunderstood what she saw. The social worker turned to me. "Did either of them touch you?" I held out my hands. Purple marks were forming around both wrists. A nurse photographed them, measured the bruising, and entered the images into my medical record. The social worker explained that the hospital was making a mandatory report for suspected abuse of a child. Security preserved the hallway footage, visitor logs, and access records. The ventilator data and alarm timeline were flagged, so nothing could be overwritten. For the first time since the crash, someone treated the details as if they mattered. Dr. Nadim came out nearly 40 minutes later. "Lark is stable," she said. "We replaced the tube. There is swelling and trauma to the airway, so we are keeping her sedated and monitoring her through the night." "Did this hurt her brain?" "We restored oxygen quickly. I cannot promise there was no additional injury, but her levels recovered. We will keep assessing her." I pressed one hand against the glass. "Can I go back in?" "Yes, only you." As security led Odette toward one waiting room and Corinne toward another, my mother slowed near the corner. She looked at my sister, not at me. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "From now on, you only say she pulled it out herself." Odette nodded. Neither of them realized I was close enough to hear. I looked through the glass at Lark, at the fresh tape holding the new breathing tube in place, and then at the fading reflection of my mother and sister in the corridor. That night had not ended with an accident. It had begun with a new version of the truth, and my mother was already teaching my sister how to tell it. I stayed beside Lark for the rest of the night, with my chair pulled close enough that my knee touched the rail of her bed. The new breathing tube was secured with fresh white tape. Medication kept her still while the swelling in her throat was monitored. Every time the ventilator released its measured hiss, I watched her chest rise and told myself that the next breath belonged to her, not to Odette, not to Corinne, and not to whatever story they were building outside that room. Security had removed both of them from the ICU floor. Their visitor permissions had been suspended, their badges deactivated, and their names placed on a restricted list at every entrance to the unit. The hospital social worker, Elena Ruiz, returned shortly after midnight with the mandatory report. The hospital had notified law enforcement and Child Protective Services, preserved the camera and visitor records, and flagged the ventilator data so nothing could be overwritten. Odette had been escorted from the building. Corinne had left separately. Neither could return without hospital approval. A nurse brought an ice pack for my wrists. The bruises had darkened into 2 uneven bands. On the screen, the ventilator had recorded the sudden loss of pressure, and every second Lark went without a secured airway. My sister could call it panic. My mother could call it confusion. The machine had no reason to protect either of them. Around 3, an officer took a preliminary statement. I gave him only what I had seen and heard. Odette approached the bed, pulled the tube free, and said the machines were prolonging Lark's suffering. I moved toward my daughter. Corinne locked both my arms behind my back. Neither woman pressed the call button. When he asked whether I believed Odette meant to kill Lark, I looked at the recorder. I know what she did. I don't know what words she used inside her own head to permit herself to do it. Before dawn, I opened Lark's last text again. Mom, can you get me instead? Beneath it sat my answer. Grandma and Aunt Odette are already on their way. I'll see you at home. I had treated her fear like a transportation problem and answered without asking the one word that mattered. Why? At 8, Dr. Nadim examined Lark's throat and reviewed the overnight imaging. The swelling had improved, but she would not remove the tube until Lark followed commands, passed a spontaneous breathing trial, and proved she could maintain her airway. Lark squeezed the doctor's fingers, released them on command, and moved her toes beneath the blanket. For the first time since the accident, an action began inside my daughter and reached the outside world. I'm here, sweetheart, I whispered. You only have to listen to the doctors. The respiratory team tested her for hours. Nobody treated waking as a dramatic moment. It came through small responses and cautious decisions. A little after 10, Elena came to the door. Your mother contacted me, she said. My body tightened before I could stop it. What does she want? She asked whether the police had received the hospital report. I waited for the rest. There was no rest. She didn't ask about Lark? Elena's expression stayed professional, but her pause answered before her words did. No. Her first question was about the report. I looked at my daughter, whose throat had been injured because Corinne chose to restrain me rather than stop Odette. What did you tell her? That a mandatory report had been submitted, and I could not discuss its contents. Did Odette call? Not through me. I folded the ice pack on my lap. It had gone warm hours earlier. My mother will try to come back. Security has been informed. She won't shout. She won't threaten anyone. She'll speak quietly until somebody mistakes calmness for innocence. Elena wrote something on the clipboard she carried. I'll make sure the security supervisor hears that. At 11:26, Dr. Nadim and the respiratory team entered wearing gowns and gloves. They explained each step to me, and then to Lark, even though she was still drowsy. Lark, we are going to remove the tube, Dr. Nadim said. Your throat will hurt, you may cough. We will be right here. Lark's eyes opened halfway. They were unfocused at first, then moved toward the sound of my voice. I stood near her shoulder and held her hand. The tube was removed in one controlled movement. Lark coughed hard, and a sound came from her throat that was more air than voice. The respiratory therapist placed oxygen beneath her nose and watched her numbers. Her oxygen level dipped, then climbed. I did not breathe normally until Dr. Nadim said she was stable. Lark tried to speak. Don't, I whispered. You don't have to. Her lips moved around a sound I could not understand. Dr. Nadim gave her a small sponge to wet her mouth and explained that the soreness would make speech difficult. She asked Lark simple questions that could be answered with a nod. Did she know her name? Lark nodded. Did she know I was her mother? Another nod. Did she know she was in a hospital? Her brow tightened, then she nodded again. Dr. Nadim did not ask about the accident. Neither did I. Shortly before noon, Elena returned with a security supervisor. Corinne is downstairs, she said. She says she has personal belongings that belong to you and Lark. She is requesting 5 minutes to speak with you. No. She says she will leave the belongings with security if you refuse. I looked at the backpack under Lark's chair. Nothing my mother carried could be more important than keeping her away. Then I thought of the sentence I had overheard the night before. From now on, you only say she pulled it out herself. I needed that sentence included in my formal statement. I also needed Corinne to understand that I had heard it. I'll meet her in the consultation room, I said. She does not come near Lark. Security stays inside. Elena studied me for a moment. You can end the meeting at any time. I know. The consultation room sat in a security-controlled family suite just outside the patient corridor, close enough for a raised voice to carry but separated from Lark by a locked access door. It held a rectangular table, 4 plastic chairs, and a narrow window facing the hall. A security officer remained inside. Corinne entered, carrying my coat and a canvas bag of Lark's clothes. She looked as composed as she had the previous evening. Her eyes moved to my wrists. You bruise easily, she said. I stared at her. Not how is Lark? Not is she breathing on her own? Not did the doctor save her. You bruise easily. She placed the bag on the table. Odette hasn't slept, she said. She is falling apart. Lark's tube was removed this morning under medical supervision. She is breathing. Corinne's shoulders lowered by less than an inch. I'm glad. You didn't ask. I assumed Elena would have told me if something happened. You asked Elena whether the police received the report. Her mouth tightened. Because once paperwork starts moving, people stop seeing a family and start seeing categories. Attempted harm to a child is a category they should see. She did not attempt to harm Lark. I watched her pull out the tube. Odette had been awake for almost 2 days. She thought Lark had no chance. The doctor had just said Lark might wake up. Then Odette asked whether she would remember. She panicked. She tore a breathing tube out of my daughter's throat and lied when the nurses entered. You were hysterical. You held my arms before any medical staff came through the door. Corinne's gaze dropped to the tabletop. She was not searching for the truth. She was testing explanations to discover which one sounded least criminal. Don't report your sister, she whispered. It was a stupid prank. The room went silent. Even the security officer turned his head. I leaned forward. What kind of prank requires a woman to lock her daughter's arms behind her back while her granddaughter cannot breathe? Corinne's face hardened. I have explained why I held you. No, you have renamed it. You are angry. My daughter almost died twice in 2 days. And destroying Odette will not heal her. I did not make Odette touch that tube. She needs treatment, not prison. Lark needed oxygen. Corinne's lips pressed into a narrow line. I stood. The meeting is over. Marin, think about what this will do to our family. I looked at the woman who had restrained me while Lark fought for air. You already decided what could be done to our family. You just decided Lark would be the one to absorb it. I opened the door and asked security to escort her from the floor. As security led Corinne through the locked access door, her voice rose for the first time and carried into the patient corridor. You will regret turning one moment into the only thing that defines your sister. I returned to Lark's room without answering. Elena met me outside and helped me add Corinne's exact words to my supplemental statement. The security officer provided his name as a witness. I wrote the sentence slowly, making sure every word was correct. Don't report your sister. It was a stupid prank. When I entered the room, Lark was awake. Her eyes were fixed on the door. The heart monitor showed a faster rhythm than it had when I left. Her right hand clutched the blanket and pulled it toward her throat. What happened? I asked. Dr. Nadim stepped closer. She heard a woman's voice in the hall. My mother. Lark's eyes widened. I closed the door. Dr. Nadim called security and asked them to confirm Corinne had left the ICU floor. A minute later, they confirmed she had entered the elevator under escort. She's gone, I told Lark. She cannot come in here. Lark looked at the glass door, as if Corinne might appear through it anyway. I lowered the shade over the window. You do not have to tell us anything, I said. "You don't have to explain the accident. You don't have to answer questions. I only need you to know that I'm here." Her fingers loosened slightly around the blanket. I sat close, but I did not touch her until she moved her hand toward mine. Her palm felt warm and weak. Dr. Nadim checked her oxygen and listened to her breathing. "Your throat is sore," she told Lark. "Use as few words as you need." Lark looked at the doctor. Then she looked at me. Her eyes held the same question that had been inside her text before the accident. Would I listen this time? She tried to speak and coughed instead. I lifted the moistened sponge and touched it to her lips, the way the nurse had shown me. I did not ask what happened. I did not say Odette's name. I did not tell her what I suspected. "Take your time," I whispered. Lark swallowed carefully. Her voice was barely more than breath. "Grandma crashed. Aunt switched their seats." 6 words. Each one seemed to remain in the room after her voice stopped. Grandma crashed. Aunt switched their seats. I did not understand everything at once. I only knew that the sentence did not fit the story we had been given. Dr. Nadim moved closer to the bed. "Lark, I am going to repeat what I heard. You said, 'Grandma crashed. Aunt switched their seats.'" Lark closed her eyes and nodded once. The door was still partly open from the nurse's last entrance. Across the nurse's station, the door to a secured interview room opened as 2 officers prepared to escort Odette out. The room was only a few yards away and had no direct access to the patient corridor. She had returned to speak with the hospital investigator and had remained under guard. Dr. Nadim repeated all 6 words in a clear clinical voice. Odette heard the entire sentence. She stopped walking. All the color left her face. She turned toward Lark's room. "She's delirious," Odette said. "She doesn't know what she's saying." One of the officers moved between her and the doorway. Odette took a step forward. "Ask her who told her to say that." Lark's fingers tightened around mine. "Get her away from this room," Dr. Nadim said. The officers turned Odette around and moved her toward the secured waiting area. Dr. Nadim did not argue with her. She asked the nurse to record the exact time, the exact words, everyone who had heard them, Lark's physical condition, and Odette's response. Then she reached for the phone. "This is Dr. Syra Nadim in the pediatric ICU," she said when the dispatcher answered. "Our hospital filed a mandatory report overnight concerning intentional removal of a child's airway. The patient has now regained consciousness and identified the same family member as participating in the staging of the vehicle crash that caused her injuries. That individual is currently on this floor and has heard the identification. We need an immediate law enforcement response." The unit changed around us. Security closed the access doors at both ends of the ICU. Staff checked every visitor badge. Odette was held in a secured room away from the patient wing. An officer was sent to confirm that Corinne had left the hospital grounds. Elena submitted an additional child safety report and documented that I was Lark's sole legal parent and her protective caregiver. I turned off my phone when calls from relatives began arriving. I did not read the messages. I sat beside Lark and watched Dr. Nadim explain that police officers were coming, but Lark would not be forced to answer questions immediately. "You did nothing wrong," I told her. Her lips moved. I leaned closer. "Grandma mad?" The 2 words hurt more than the 6. "No," I said. "Grandma does not get to make you responsible for what she chose." Lark looked toward the closed shade. "Jail?" "I don't know what will happen yet." Her eyes filled with tears. I held her hand without squeezing it. "You only told us what you remembered. The adults will handle the rest." Detective Aaron Keene arrived less than 20 minutes later, with 2 uniformed officers. He was broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, and careful about where he stood. He remained near the door until Dr. Nadim confirmed Lark was medically stable. He did not ask her questions. He reviewed the overnight report, the photographs of my wrists, the ventilator timeline, and the medical statements. Then he asked me to repeat Lark's 6 words and confirm that I had never suggested Corinne was driving or discussed a seat switch in front of her. I believed Odette's story until last night, I said. Who was the last person alone with Lark before the crash? My mother and my sister. Who was supposed to be driving? Odette. Who told you she was driving? Both of them. Keene closed the report. Outside the consultation room, I saw an officer lead Odette toward the elevator in handcuffs. She looked through the glass and found me. For the first time in my life, she did not look toward Corinne to see what expression she should wear. Detective Keene followed my gaze. At this point, she is being arrested based on probable cause related to the ICU incident, he said. Your statement, the medical findings, the equipment data, and the witness accounts are sufficient for us to act. Your daughter's words create a separate investigative issue. They are not, by themselves, proof of what happened on the road. I understand. We will examine the original crash report again. What about my mother? She will be interviewed. Until we know more, she is not to contact Lark or enter this hospital. The district attorney can seek additional protective orders. He opened the report once more and looked at the sentence Dr. Nadim had written in quotation marks. Grandma crashed. Aunt switched their seats. Then he looked at me. So your daughter was with both of them before the crash. Your sister may have interfered with her airway after learning she could regain memory, and your mother physically prevented you from stopping it. Yes. Keene placed one hand over the 2 reports, the crash and the ICU. Then we do not have one incident inside a hospital, he said. We have 2 crime scenes. Detective Keene's words followed me back into Lark's room. 2 crime scenes. Until then, I had been holding the crash and the ICU apart because putting them together meant accepting something I was not ready to name. The crash could still have been reckless. The 7 minutes before anyone called for help could still have been panic. But Odette had heard that Lark might wake up, asked whether she would remember, and then put her hand on the breathing tube. That was no longer a collection of terrible coincidences. Someone had built a story, and my daughter had nearly died inside it. Odette spent that night in county custody, while investigators reviewed the hospital evidence. Corinne was not arrested. She was interviewed, served with written notice that she could not contact Lark, and ordered to remain away from the hospital while the investigation continued. She called my phone 11 times before midnight. I did not answer. Then the family messages began. My Aunt Meredith wrote first. Your mother says you are trying to have Odette charged with attempted murder. She is traumatized and needs psychiatric care, not punishment. A cousin I had not spoken to in nearly 2 years wrote that survivors often behaved irrationally after serious accidents. My cousin Sylvia added that 48 hours without sleep could distort what I thought I had seen. Another relative asked whether I truly wanted my own sister to spend the rest of her life in prison because of one panicked moment. Not one message asked whether Lark could breathe without pain. Not one person asked what it felt like for a 10-year-old child to wake and see the woman who had pulled out her breathing tube standing in the hallway. Corinne had moved faster than the investigation. Before the hospital had finished preserving the ventilator data, she had already given the family a version in which Odette was a frightened survivor, I was an unstable mother, and Lark was a confused child under heavy medication. I turned off message previews and gave my phone to Elena Ruiz. Keep it powered on, she said. Do not delete anything. You do not need to read the messages, but investigators may need the contact history. She helped me create a simple log on a hospital notepad. Time, caller, method of contact, and whether the person mentioned Corinne or Odette. Recording facts steadied me. It was what I did at work when people argued about permits and altered records. A timestamp could not be shamed into changing its mind. The county approved emergency family leave, and coworkers donated enough unused hours to keep our health insurance intact while I stayed with Lark. She remained in the pediatric ICU through the weekend. She slept often and spoke very little because of the swelling in her throat. When she was awake, she watched the door. If footsteps stopped outside, her fingers moved toward the blanket at her neck. If someone entered from behind her bed, her heart rate rose before she saw who it was. Dr. Nadim changed the room arrangement so no one could approach Lark from behind. Staff announced their names before entering. The shade remained closed over the glass whenever Lark rested. No one asked her about the crash. On Monday, October 20th, a woman named Tamsin Cole came to the hospital with a small rolling case and a folder that did not contain any visible police insignia. She introduced herself as a forensic interviewer, trained to speak with children after traumatic events. Her voice was gentle, but she did not speak to Lark as though she were much younger than 10. "I am not here to make you remember," Tamsin told her. "I am not here to tell you what happened. I only want to hear what you know, including when you do not know something." Lark looked at me. "You will be nearby," Tamsin said. "But your mom will not be in the room while we talk. That helps me know the answers are yours." I wanted to object. Every part of me wanted to remain within reach of my daughter. Then Lark gave a small nod. So I kissed her forehead and waited in the family consultation room with Elena. The interview lasted 28 minutes. No one allowed me to watch it live. Tamsin explained that the recording would be preserved through the investigation, but limiting observers protected both Lark and the integrity of what she said. When Tamsin came out, she sat across from me and kept her hands folded over the closed folder. Lark confirmed the words she said on Friday, she told me. She identified where she had been sitting and where she remembered your mother and sister being. She also said there are parts she cannot remember. Did she say who was driving? Thompson held my gaze. "I cannot give you a full account of the interview. Detective Keene will discuss what is appropriate. The most important thing for you to do is not question her afterward." "I won't. Even questions that sound harmless can create pressure. Do not ask if she is sure. Do not ask what else she remembers. If she brings something up, listen, reassure her, and contact me or Detective Keene. What do I say if she thinks this is her fault? You tell her adults are responsible for adult choices." When I returned to the room, Lark was drawing on a hospital clipboard. 3 uneven circles sat in a row. One was larger than the others. She had pressed the pencil so hard into the paper that the point had torn through the center circle. I sat beside her without asking what they meant. She looked at me. "Did I do it right?" "You told the truth as you remember it. That is all anyone can ask." "What if I remember wrong? Then you say you are not sure." Her eyes dropped to the page. "Grandma says I mix sounds up." My throat tightened, but I kept my voice level. "Grandma is not allowed to decide what you remember." Lark did not answer. She drew another line around the outside circle until it became almost black. That afternoon, Detective Keene returned with a binder divided by colored tabs. He did not bring the entire case file into Lark's room. We met in the consultation room while Elena stayed with her. Keene began with the ICU. My statement had remained consistent. Odette claimed the tube came out while she tried to stabilize it. Corinne claimed she restrained me only after the alarm to clear space for staff. The objective records did not support them. The ventilator showed an abrupt total loss of pressure, not a gradual leak. Lark's documented strength was too weak for her to tear off the holder and pull the tube with controlled force. The follow-up examination showed trauma consistent with forceful, unplanned removal. The charge nurse had entered after the alarm, but she found Odette at the head of the bed and Corinne directly behind me. The room had no camera aimed at the patient, yet the hallway camera captured the doorway and part of the room through the glass. He turned his tablet toward me. The image was silent. Odette stood near the foot of Lark's bed. Corinne was beside the counter. I was seated near the rail. Odette looked toward the hall. She waited. Then she leaned slightly until she could see the nurse's station through the glass. She turned back toward the bed and moved out of the camera's narrow angle. Less than 30 seconds later, the alarm began. Nurses appeared from both ends of the hallway. Keene stopped the video. "She checked where the staff were," I said. "It appears that she looked into the hallway twice. Her attorney may argue that she was anxious or looking for a nurse. We document the action, A jury or court determines what it means when combined with everything else. He showed me the photographs of my wrists. The bruises had been measured and photographed from several angles. The security officer's statement included Corinne's words in the consultation room. "Don't report your sister. It was a stupid prank." She said that in front of a witness, Keene said. She believed using the word prank would make the act smaller. People often try to control a fact by controlling the noun attached to it. I thought of every childhood argument Corinne had softened by changing the noun. Each new word removed responsibility from the person who caused harm and placed it on whoever refused the revised definition. "What happens to Odette now?" I asked. "The district attorney will review the ICU evidence. She is being held on charges related to child endangerment and assault, while the investigation continues. Additional charges depend on medical findings and evidence of intent." "And the crash?" Keene closed the ICU section of the binder. "That story has problems." He opened the original collision report. Odette had told the highway patrol officer that a black SUV moved into her lane and forced her right. She claimed she swerved to avoid impact, struck the guardrail, and briefly lost consciousness. Corinne had supported every part of that account. "What problems?" I asked. "There was no paint transfer from another vehicle, no debris that could be connected to a second car, no tire marks showing a rapid evasive turn. The SUV did not touch them." That was Odette's explanation. But the vehicle data shows the car drifted right before impact. Steering input came late. Braking was also delayed. What does that mean? It is more consistent with a driver who failed to react in time than a driver making an immediate evasive maneuver. He placed the collision diagram in front of me. The road was straight. The weather was clear. The car had moved gradually toward the shoulder before the rear passenger side struck the beginning of the guardrail. That was where Lark had been sitting. Could the driver have been distracted? I asked. Yes. Fatigue, medication, a phone, a medical episode. We are not drawing a conclusion yet. Keene pointed to 2 timestamps. The vehicle recorded impact at 4:19. The first 911 call connected at 4:26. Odette said she was unconscious. She said she regained awareness shortly before the emergency call. 7 minutes is a long time. It can feel short after a collision. But her phone activity creates another problem. The phone had not made a call during those 7 minutes. It had not sent a message, but the screen had been activated more than once. If she was unconscious, she was not opening her phone, I said. That is one possible interpretation. Another person could have handled it. We need the device examination and statements before making that claim. Who called 911? A witness. Not your sister. Not your mother. I stared at him. They told me Odette called. The original report says a passerby placed the first completed call. Odette told the officer she had tried, but could not connect. Was there no record of an attempted call? Not in the preliminary carrier data. 7 minutes. For 2 days I had imagined Odette waking inside a damaged car and struggling to find her phone. I had imagined Corinne disoriented beside her while Lark lay injured in the back seat. Now, those 7 minutes looked less like confusion and more like room. Room to move. Room to agree. Room to decide which story would reach me before the truth did. Keene asked whether Corinne had ever experienced a medical problem that might affect driving. I hesitated. Earlier this year, she mentioned what she called a confusion episode. When? I don't know exactly. She said she became disoriented in a grocery store parking lot and forgot where she had parked. She laughed about it. Anything else? In July, Odette started driving her to appointments more often. Mom said she was tired of traffic. Did Corinne tell you a doctor had restricted her driving? No. Did you ever tell her not to drive Lark? Yes. In September. I asked directly because she had mentioned another episode. She said her doctor had cleared everything and the testing was finished. Do you have that conversation in writing? Part of it, she texted that I was treating her like an invalid. Keene asked me to preserve the message and not forward it to anyone. Then he showed me 2 medical photographs taken on the night of the crash. The first showed bruising across Corinne's upper chest and near her left wrist. The second showed a diagonal bruise across Odette's torso. "I'm not a doctor," I said. The emergency physician noted that Corinne's bruising pattern was commonly associated with the driver's side restraint and steering area. Odette's injury was more consistent with the passenger position. Commonly associated is not proof. "No. Airbags deploy violently. Bodies rotate. Seats may be adjusted. One injury pattern does not establish who was driving, but their bodies do not match the story. They raise a question the story does not answer." I looked at the pictures again. Corinne had told police that she had been in the passenger seat. Odette had told police that she had been behind the wheel. Lark had whispered the opposite. Keene gathered the reports, but left the collision diagram in front of me. "We are requesting preservation of the vehicle's event data, toxicology results, hospital records, DMV records, route video, and phone data," he said. "Some items require warrants or court orders. That takes time." What should I do? Stay with your daughter. Preserve every message. Do not confront Corinne about her medical history. Do not ask Lark to explain the crash. I need to know what happened. You need evidence that can survive more than a family argument. When I returned to Lark's room, my phone contained 32 missed calls and more than 60 messages. Elena had sorted them by sender, without opening the contents. One voicemail from Aunt Meredith had been transcribed, automatically. "Your mother is 67 years old. Do you want her to die in prison because she tried to stop you from making a scene?" I read the sentence twice. Corinne had not been accused publicly of causing the crash. Detective Keene had not told the family about the injury patterns. The investigation had only begun. Yet my relatives were already defending her from prison. Not defending her for restraining me. Defending her from something larger. I added the voicemail to my log. 4:47 p.m. Meredith mentioned Corinne dying in prison. No allegation about crash shared by me. Lark watched me write. "Are they mad?" she whispered. "They are worried about the wrong people." "Because of me?" I put down the pen. "No, adults made choices. Adults are responsible for those choices." She looked toward the door. I moved my chair so I was between her bed and the entrance. "You do not have to carry their fear," I said. That evening, Keene returned for less than 5 minutes. He did not sit down. He placed 2 printed photographs on the table in the consultation room, Corinne's bruising in one, Odette's in the other. He positioned the emergency physician's notes beneath them. Then, he looked at me. "If Odette was driving," he said, "why do their bodies tell the opposite story?" 3 days after Detective Keene placed the photographs of Corinne's and Odette's injuries side by side, he asked me to retrace the route they had taken with Lark. Lark had been moved from intensive care to a pediatric step-down room. She still needed oxygen at night, and speaking made her throat ache, but she could sit upright for short periods. Elena stayed with her while I left the hospital. I almost refused. Leaving Lark felt wrong, even for an hour. Every hallway sound still made her look toward the door. But Keene said he needed me to identify the exact pickup point and the route Corinne normally used between Lark's after-school program and my townhouse. He drove an unmarked county car. I sat in the passenger seat with a printed map on my lap and my phone sealed inside an evidence bag beside me. We started at Lark School in East Sacramento. Her after-school program used a side entrance near the gym. Parents and approved relatives signed children out through an electronic kiosk. The records showed Odette had entered her code at 3:58 that Wednesday. Corinne's name did not appear because Odette was the adult listed as collecting Lark. That had been the plan. Odette was supposed to drive. Keene pulled away from the curb and waited for my directions. "At the next light, turn right," I said. "Then take Folsom Boulevard west. My house is less than 15 minutes from here." He followed the route I had taken dozens of times. We passed the grocery store where Lark liked the cinnamon rolls, the library branch with the metal sculpture out front, and the intersection where traffic usually slowed near 5. Nothing required a detour. There were no closed lanes, no construction barriers, and no reason to leave the direct road home. Keen stopped at a red light. Your sister told the responding officer they changed routes because of roadwork. There hasn't been roadwork here since spring. Could there have been an emergency closure that day? I would have known. My office receives county road notices, and I drive this route. He nodded but did not treat my answer as proof. He entered it into a small recorder and continued driving. At the next major intersection, the route home required us to keep going straight. Keen turned left. This is the path recorded by traffic cameras, he said. The road carried us farther from my townhouse. Where were they going? That is what we are reconstructing. We passed 2 office buildings, a bank, and a neighborhood pharmacy. Keen pulled into the parking lot and stopped beside the curb. The store's sign was visible from the road. I recognized the name immediately. Corinne filled her prescriptions there. She came here, I said. According to the transaction records, she picked up a newly filled prescription at 4-5. What prescription? I cannot discuss the full medical record. The pharmacy confirmed it was a sedating medication with a warning against driving until the patient understood its effects. I looked through the windshield at the automatic doors. Corinne had told me she was no longer taking anything that made her drowsy. She had said the doctor changed her medications after the confusion episode in the grocery store parking lot. Did she take it before the crash? Toxicology may help answer that. The laboratory results are still being reviewed. So Odette drove here, then Mom went inside? That is their current claim. Their current claim? Keen kept both hands on the steering wheel. Your mother now acknowledges driving for part of the trip. She says Odette drove away from the school, stopped here, then asked her to take over because Odette's wrist hurt. Odette told police she drove the entire time. Yes. They changed the story after Lark spoke. They changed it after being shown that video from nearby businesses, placed your mother behind the wheel at some point before the collision. He drove around the rear of the pharmacy and returned to the street. From there, the car had continued east, away from my home, then turned onto a quieter road near the river. The traffic thinned. Houses gave way to trees, storage yards, and sections of old industrial fencing. The road curved gradually before narrowing near a guardrail. Keen pulled onto the shoulder several yards before the impact point. The damaged section had been replaced, but new metal shone beside older gray panels. Small pieces of glass remained in the dirt beneath the rail. I got out slowly. The air smelled of dry grass and exhaust from the distant highway. Cars passed every few minutes, but the road was quiet enough that I could hear leaves scraping across the pavement. This is not on the way home, I said. No. Did either of them explain why they came here? Odette said they were avoiding construction. Corinne said they planned to stop at a garden store. There is no garden store on this road. There was one 2 miles farther east. It closed last year. I stared at the repaired guardrail. They had not become lost by accident. Corinne knew Sacramento better than almost anyone I knew. She had lived there for 40 years and treated directions as another form of authority. Could she have been confused already? I asked. That is one possibility. I stepped toward the shoulder where the car had left the lane. The tire impressions were gone. But Keen showed me photographs taken that afternoon. The vehicle had drifted gradually to the right. There was no sharp line indicating a sudden evasive turn. The first hard braking occurred less than a second before impact. The guardrail struck the rear passenger door first and crushed the space around Lark's seat. The front airbags protected Corinne and Odette, but nothing stopped the metal from folding toward my daughter. I wrapped my arms around myself. Keen did not ask me to move closer. The event data recorder confirms speed, braking, throttle position, seatbelt status, and the time of impact, he said. It cannot identify the driver. What time? 4, 19 and 12 seconds. And the first 911 call was 4:26. Yes, 7 minutes. Keen pointed toward a paved walking path that ran parallel to the road behind a row of trees. A jogger was approximately a quarter-mile away when he heard the crash. He reached the vehicle within a few minutes. What did he see? He is being interviewed formally today. I can tell you he disputed part of the original report. I looked back at the road. What part? The positions of the adults. That afternoon, I returned to Lark's room with dried dirt on the soles of my shoes and 7 minutes pressing against the inside of my chest. She was working with a pediatric occupational therapist named Beth. They had placed objects on a tray and asked Lark to group them by texture and sound. A wooden block, a rubber ball, a plastic cup filled with beads, a small electronic timer. Beth pressed the timer button. 3 short beeps sounded. Lark dropped the pencil she was holding. Her shoulders pulled upward, and her eyes fixed on the timer. Beth immediately turned it off. "You are safe," she said. "That sound surprised you. We can put it away." Lark reached for the paper on her tray. She drew 3 circles, one near the left edge, one beside it, a third below them. Then she darkened the circle on the upper left. Beth did not ask what the circles meant. "Would you like me to move the timer out of the room?" Lark nodded. After Beth left, I remained in my chair and followed Tamsin Cole's instructions. I did not ask whether the circles were seats. I did not ask who had been sitting in them. I waited. Lark touched the darkened circle. "Grandma smell?" she whispered. Her voice was stronger than it had been 2 days earlier, but still rough. "What do you remember about the smell?" I asked, using the neutral question Tamsin had taught me. "Flowers." Corinne wore the same rose and amber perfume every day. It was strong enough to remain in a room after she left. Lark pointed to the upper left circle again. Then she drew a line from the upper right circle toward it. "Move over," she whispered. I kept my hands folded in my lap so she would not see them shake. "Is that something you remember hearing?" She nodded. "Do you know who said it?" Her brow tightened. "I don't know." "That is okay." "Before loud?" "I don't know, sweetheart. You do not have to make it fit." She pressed the pencil against the paper, then let it roll from her hand. I did not ask another question. I stepped into the hall and called Tamsin. She told me to photograph the drawing exactly as it was, write down Lark's words without adding my interpretation, and place the original in an envelope for the investigative team. When I returned, Lark was staring at the circles. "Did I remember bad?" she asked. "You remembered pieces. You are allowed to remember pieces. Grandma says stories need order." "Stories do. Memories after something frightening do not always come in order." She looked at the dark circle. I wanted to tell her I believed Corinne had been in the driver's seat. I wanted to ask whether the rose perfume had surrounded her before the crash or after it. Instead, I put the drawing inside the envelope and wrote the time on the front. Facts first. Interpretation later. That evening, Detective Keene returned with new information from the roadside witness. His name was Daniel Price. He was 54, lived nearby, and ran the same path 4 afternoons each week. He heard metal strike the guardrail at approximately 4:19 and reached the car several minutes later. "He saw smoke from the airbags," Keene said. "The engine was still running. Lark was unresponsive in the rear passenger seat." "And Corinne?" Mr. Price saw her standing beside the open driver's door. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Standing outside it or climbing out? He remembers her upper body emerging from that side, when he came through the trees. He cannot say whether she had been seated there at the exact moment of impact. What about Odette? She was on the passenger side. One door was open. She was shouting that her phone would not connect. But she had not called. Carrier records show no emergency call attempt before 4:26. What did Daniel do? He asked whether someone had called 911. Odette said she was trying. He waited several seconds, realized no one was speaking with the dispatcher, and used his own phone. The first completed call began at 4:26 and 11 seconds. Daniel stayed until firefighters arrived. He had not seen the exact seat switch, but he saw Corinne at the open driver's door, Odette on the passenger side, and Lark unconscious in the back while doors were repeatedly opened. The 7 minutes could not be reconstructed second by second, but they no longer belonged to darkness. Neither woman called for help. Then a stranger arrived and forced the emergency into the open. The following morning, Keene shared the preliminary findings that affected Lark's case. The event recorder fixed the impact time, but not the driver's identity. Corinne's blood was on the driver's airbag. Odette's biological trace was on the passenger airbag, and fibers from their clothing matched the corresponding restraints. Their bruises pointed in the same directions. The driver's seat had been pushed farther back than Corinne normally used it, though the motor stored no timestamp. Odette's phone screen opened 4 times before Daniel's 911 call, yet no emergency number was dialed. Toxicology also showed a sedating prescription in Corinne's blood, although the result alone could not prove impairment at the moment of impact. No single fact proves the switch, Keene said. Together, they contradict the first story and show both women had the opportunity to rearrange the scene. We still cannot claim every word they exchanged during the delay. On Wednesday, investigators obtained video from the pharmacy's exterior security system. The camera had recorded the parking lot from a high angle. The image was not sharp enough to show facial details clearly, but the clothing and body shapes were distinct. Keene invited me to view the relevant section at the sheriff's office. The timestamp read 4:07 p.m., 12 minutes before the crash. A dark sedan entered the lot and parked near the pharmacy entrance. The passenger door opened first. Corinne stepped out wearing her beige wool coat. She walked into the pharmacy. Odette remained behind the steering wheel. For 6 minutes, nothing changed. Then Corinne returned, carrying a white pharmacy bag. She stopped beside the driver's door. Odette Godot. The two women spoke for several seconds, though the camera had no audio. Odette gestured once toward the car. Corinne held out her hand. Odette placed the keys in it. Corinne got into the driver's seat. Odette walked around the front of the car and entered the passenger side. Lark climbed back into the rear passenger seat after briefly stepping onto the curb. Then the sedan left the lot, with Corinne behind the wheel. I watched the recording 3 times. The third time, I focused on Lark. Before getting into the back seat, she stood beside the open door and looked toward Odette. She did not move until Odette touched her shoulder. At 4:09, Lark had been holding her phone. My own phone records showed her message had reached me at 3:42, before they collected her. But there had been no second text from the pharmacy. Maybe she had considered sending one. Maybe she had looked at my reply and understood I had already chosen convenience over her uneasiness. Keene paused the video on Corinne's hand resting at the top of the steering wheel. "This establishes your mother drove away from the pharmacy," he said. "Her attorney now says Odette took over somewhere between this location and the crash." "Where?" "They have not identified a location." "Is there video of them stopping?" "None found yet." "They expect you to believe they changed drivers on the side of the road, then changed back after the crash?" "I expect them to keep adjusting the account each time evidence removes another version." I stared at Corinne's frozen image, her hand on the wheel. Odette, besid here. Lark behind them. There was no black SUV in the frame, no construction detour, no emergency forcing them onto that road. Only 3 people leaving a pharmacy, one of them already afraid enough to ask her mother to come instead. When I returned to the hospital, Lark was asleep with the sound map drawing on the table beside her. 3 circles. The upper left one darkened until the paper had nearly torn. I sat down and opened our last text conversation. "Mom, can you get me instead?" For days, I had read it as a request I had failed to honor. Now I saw it for what it had been. A warning. I looked at my daughter's sleeping face, then at the photograph Keene had allowed me to keep of Corinne entering the driver's seat. I could not ask Lark for another memory. I could not pull the truth out of her faster than her mind could safely return it. So I asked the questions, what had you seen that made you afraid to ride with them? The answer to my question arrived in a government envelope Corinne had signed for nearly 3 months before the crash. Detective Keene showed me the copy the following Monday in a conference room at the sheriff's office. A red stamp marked the top right corner. California Department of Motor Vehicles. Notice of temporary suspension. Effective July 21st, 2025. Corinne had signed the certified delivery receipt herself. She told me it was a routine review, I said. Keane turned the page toward me. The notice stated that Corinne's driving privilege had been suspended pending medical evaluation. It referenced a physician's report concerning episodes of disorientation and the possible effects of prescribed medication on reaction time. This was not a suggestion. It was not a misunderstanding. It was an order. How did you get this? I asked. A court order gave us access to the DMV record. We also obtained a limited set of medical documents directly related to her ability to drive. We do not have her entire medical history, and we do not need it. He placed 2 clinical summaries beside the suspension notice. The first incident had happened in April. Corinne became disoriented while driving home from a garden center. She stopped in the middle of an intersection after the traffic signal changed and remained there until another driver approached her window. She later told her physician that she had forgotten where she was going. The second episode happened in June. She became confused in a grocery store parking lot and tried to unlock a vehicle that was not hers. A store employee found her crying beside it and called Odette. Corinne had described that event to me as a funny story about modern cars all looking the same. Her neurologist had ordered additional testing and instructed her not to drive while the evaluation continued. The warning was repeated after her prescription changed because the new medication could cause drowsiness, delayed reaction, and confusion. Did the doctor report her to the DMV? I asked. Yes. And Mom knew. She acknowledged the warning in writing. She also completed the first page of the DMV medical review form. I looked again at her signature. Corinne Valle. The handwriting was firm and deliberate. She had not signed while confused. She had signed because she understood exactly what the document meant. What did she tell Odette? That is less clear. Odette says Corinne told her the suspension was temporary paperwork and had already been resolved. But phone records show Odette drove her to at least 5 medical appointments after July 21st. She knew Mom was not supposed to drive. She knew there was a driving restriction. Whether she knew the DMV suspension remained active is something her attorney disputes. I remembered every time Odette had arrived at family dinners with Corinne beside her. Mom had complained about being dependent on other people's schedules. Odette had laughed and called herself the family chauffeur. I had thought they were adjusting to a medical recommendation. I had not known Corinne was legally forbidden to be behind the wheel. Why would Odette hand her the keys at the pharmacy? Keane closed the folder. That is the question she will eventually have to answer under circumstances where the answer has consequences. I already knew part of it. Corinne had spent her life making resistance feel cruel. If I questioned her, I was humiliating her. If Odette refused her, she was abandoning an aging mother. If Lark felt unsafe, she was being dramatic. Corinne did not need to force the keys from my sister's hand. She only needed to stand beside the driver's door and make refusal feel like betrayal. Keane showed me a message exchange between Corinne and Odette from the week before the crash. The investigators had recovered it from Odette's phone under a search warrant. Corinne had written that the DMV had finished its review and that her license was fine. Odette asked whether she had received written confirmation. Corinne replied that she did not need a piece of paper to know whether she could drive. Odette sent back a single word. Okay. That proves Mom lied, I said. It proves she represented the restriction as resolved. It also proves Odette asked for confirmation and accepted an answer that did not provide it. She chose not to know. That may be how the prosecution describes it. The pharmacy video made that choice visible. Odette had been in the driver's seat when Corinne returned with the medication. She could have kept the keys. She could have called me. She could have told Corinne to sit in the passenger seat. Instead, she handed over control of the car while Lark watched from the curb. Keane placed a still image from the video beside Lark's message to me. Mom, can you get me instead? The timestamps were 25 minutes apart. Lark had sent the message before Odette collected her, but the records from her phone showed she opened our conversation again while they were parked at the pharmacy. She had read my reply. Then, she had watched Corinne take the driver's seat. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the table. She knew something was wrong before they picked her up. What do you mean? Lark did not usually ask me to change pickup plans. If she wanted me instead, she had a reason. Has she said what the reason was? No. Keen waited. I understood what he was asking, without him saying it. I could not turn my guilt into a question and place it in Lark's mouth. I will not ask her, I said. That is the right choice. It did not feel right. It felt like standing outside a locked room while my daughter remained inside with the answer. The next piece came from a pharmacy employee. The bottle was a higher dose refill of a sedating medication Corinne had already been taking. Corinne told the pharmacist she had taken her scheduled morning dose, so the drug was already in her system. The pharmacist repeated the warning not to drive and explained that the increased dose could intensify drowsiness and delayed reaction. Corinne replied that her daughter was driving, then took a tablet with water from the store fountain. 8 minutes later, the exterior camera showed her entering the driver's seat. The emergency room toxicology confirmed the medication in her bloodstream. Investigators did not claim the tablet alone caused the crash. It was one factor beside the active suspension, her history of disorientation, and the delayed braking recorded by the car. The event data from the car showed a gradual drift toward the shoulder. There was no sudden steering input consistent with avoiding another vehicle. The brakes were applied less than 1 second before impact. Corinne had not been forced off the road. In a later account, Odette admitted Corinne had missed the turn home, refused to admit she was disoriented, and insisted the unfamiliar road would reconnect farther ahead. She failed to react until the guardrail was directly in front of her. The evidence no longer depended on Lark's memory. The airbag traces, restraint fibers, bruises, pharmacy video, Daniel's observations, and the absence of any stop where they could have changed drivers all pointed in the same direction. Corinne had been driving. Odette had been in the passenger seat. Lark sat behind her where the guardrail crushed the rear door. After the impact, the adults had time to move, adjust the driver's seat for Odette's longer legs, and prepare the story about a black SUV while Lark remained unconscious behind them. What evidence shows Odette moved the seat? I asked. The seat position, the difference in their height, Daniel's observations, the injury patterns, and the lack of another reasonable explanation, Keen said. The motor did not preserve a timestamp, so we cannot claim the exact second it moved. We can establish that the final position fit Odette better than Corinne, and they delayed calling because they needed time. The delay gave them the opportunity. Their statements and conduct will determine how the prosecution argues their purpose. They left Lark without help to protect themselves. The first completed emergency call came from Daniel. That fact will not change. I looked at the crash photograph. The rear passenger door stood open. Lark's sound map notebook lay partly beneath the front seat. Her blue pencil had rolled into the door pocket. Corinne and Odette had been moving through that car, touching doors, changing places, arranging the scene. Neither had lifted the phone and asked whether the child behind them was breathing. Keen turned to the ICU section of the file. This also changes how we evaluate what happened at the hospital. Because Odette knew Lark could identify them. Because both women had a reason to fear her memory. He laid out 3 decisions Odette had made. She gave the keys to a woman she knew had been told not to drive. She did not call 911 immediately after the crash. She told police she had been behind the wheel. Her attorney says she was trying to protect her mother during a medical crisis, Keen said. She was protecting herself too. How? If she admitted Mom was driving, she would have to admit she handed over the keys after knowing there was a restriction. She would have to explain why they waited 7 minutes. She would have to explain the seat change. Keen nodded. That is the prosecution's view. Odette had not become trapped in Corinne's lie by accident. She had entered it one choice at a time. At the pharmacy, she could have kept the keys. At the roadside, she could have called for help. When police arrived, she could have told the truth. At the hospital, She could have stepped away from the bed. She had reached 4 separate doors leading out of the lie, and closed every one herself. 2 days later, I sat across from Corinne for the first time since the consultation room at the hospital. The meeting took place at the District Attorney's Victim Witness Center. My advocate, Leah Morales, sat beside me. Corinne's defense attorney sat beside her. Detective Keene remained near the far wall. The attorneys had arranged the meeting because Corinne wanted to discuss the no-contact order and the return of several belongings from her home. I agreed because I needed to see whether she could look at me after the evidence placed her behind the wheel. She entered wearing a navy suit and no perfume. For the first time in my life, she looked smaller without the scent that always announced her arrival. She did not ask about Lark. Her attorney began by saying Corinne denied intentionally harming anyone and hoped the family could avoid further trauma. I looked directly at my mother. "You were driving." Her attorney raised one hand. "My client has acknowledged driving during part of the trip. You were driving when the car hit the guardrail." "The investigation is continuing," he said. Corinne lifted her chin. "Odette gave me the keys because her wrist hurt. She told police she drove the entire way." She was confused. "You both described the same black SUV? We believed another vehicle came close." "There was no other vehicle. You were not there. Lark was." At my daughter's name, Corinne's expression changed. Not grief. Annoyance. "Lark suffered a head injury," she said. "Her memories cannot be treated as perfect." "The airbag did not suffer a head injury." Her attorney told us to keep the conversation focused. I continued. "You signed the DMV suspension. You took medication after the pharmacist told you not to drive. Then you got behind the wheel with my daughter in the car." Corinne leaned back. "Do you think I wanted this?" "I think wanting stopped mattering when you chose to drive. I was trying to help you." The sentence was so familiar that for a moment I felt 12 years old again. Corinne helping meant deciding what everyone else should accept. "You were not helping me. You could not leave work." Odette rearranged her entire afternoon. "I picked up my prescription because no one else had time to take me. Every part of that day began because you were unavailable." My advocate shifted beside me, but I raised my hand slightly. I wanted Corinne to finish. "If you had collected your own child," she said, "none of this would have happened." There it was. The final seat in Corinne's reconstructed version of the crash. Mine. She had moved herself out of the driver's position. She had moved Odette into it. Now she was trying to place me behind the wheel. "You are blaming me because I was at work. I am saying choices have consequences. You drove while suspended. You sent Lark with us. You took a sedating drug. You trusted us. You delayed calling for help. You were not there to know what happened. I was not there because I believed my daughter was safe with her grandmother and aunt." Corinne's eyes hardened. "Then, perhaps your judgment is not as perfect as you pretend." I thought the words would break something inside me. Instead, they clarified it. Corinne did not need facts to disappear. She only needed responsibility to keep moving until it landed on someone less powerful. First Odette, then Lark, then me. Anyone except the person whose hands had been on the wheel. "You are right about one thing," I said. "My judgment was wrong. I trusted you." Corinne opened her mouth, but I continued. "I will live with that mistake. You will live with yours." Her attorney ended the meeting soon afterward. As Corinne stood, she glanced toward the papers in front of Detective Keene. For the first time, I saw fear move across her face. It vanished quickly, but not before I understood what frightened her. Not Lark's pain, not my wrists, not the 7 missing minutes. She was afraid that facts had begun existing outside her control. That evening, Keene called me at the hospital. Investigators had recovered part of a deleted message from the synchronized account cache on Odette's phone. It appeared in the thread she shared with Corinne on the night of the ICU incident. Keene could not yet provide the full extraction report, but he was authorized to read the recovered fragment because it affected the protective investigation involving Lark. "If she wakes and remembers, both our lives." The message ended there. The remaining data had not been restored. Who sent it? I asked. The fragment came from a synchronized message thread used by both phones, Keane said. The preliminary extraction has not confirmed which device originated it. When? He gave me the timestamp. 7:43 p.m. I opened the notes application, where I had recorded everything Dr. Nadim said that night. At 7:54, she told us Lark might begin waking before morning. 11 minutes. The shared thread had mentioned Lark waking and remembering before Dr. Nadim made the announcement in the room. I stared at the 2 times until my eyes blurred. 7:43分. 7:54分. What happened at 7:43? I asked. We are still reconstructing which device sent it and what each woman had already heard. We will not assume more than the evidence supports. But the meaning of the fragment did not depend on its author. Before Odette approached Lark's bed, their thread had already connected my daughter's waking with the destruction of both their lives. The sentence about ending suffering had not appeared from nowhere. It had grown inside 11 minutes of fear. I stood beside Lark's bed and watched her sleep. The oxygen line rested beneath her nose. A faint red mark remained near the corner of her mouth where the tube had torn against her skin. Odette had known Lark might remember. Corinne had known the truth would expose her. Then one woman reached for the breathing tube, while the other held my arms. For the first time, I understood the ICU incident without the word panic attached to it. They had not been reacting to Lark's suffering. They had been reacting to the possibility of her voice. By Tuesday morning, Corinne had turned the worst night of Lark's life into a family emergency centered on Odette. Aunt Meredith called the switchboard until security added her to the restricted list. 2 cousins brought flowers, were stopped in the public lobby, and began calling other relatives. Leah Morales, our victim witness advocate, directed every necessary contact through her office, while my phone preserved the rest. Their language changed, but the purpose did not. Odette had suffered a mental break. Corinne had restrained me because I was hysterical. 1 terrible second should not erase a life. They repeated the word mistake until it no longer sounded connected to an action. Nobody wrote that Odette had checked the hallway before approaching Lark's bed. Nobody mentioned that she had pulled a secured tube from an injured child's throat. Nobody described Corinne, locking both my arms behind me, before a single nurse entered the room. Their version began after the alarm. Everything before it had been removed. I opened a blank message and began typing. There was no medical team in the room when my mother grabbed me. Odette did not accidentally touch the tube. She tore it out after asking whether Lark would remember the crash. I read the words twice. Then I deleted them. Corinne did not need my agreement. She needed my participation. Every public argument gave her another sentence to isolate, reinterpret, and send to someone else as proof that I was unstable. I recorded the messages in my log instead. Sinner. Time. Exact words. Whether they mentioned Lark's health. Most did not. Lark remained in the pediatric step-down unit. She could walk a few steps with assistance, but dizziness forced her back into bed quickly. Her voice was improving, though speaking for more than a few sentences left her coughing. She still watched every doorway. We had placed a small dry erase board beside her bed. Nurses wrote their names before entering. Lark could point to a red square if she wanted someone to stop, a yellow square if she needed a break, and a green square if she was ready to continue. The system had been designed for therapy. It became part of everything. Before touching her oxygen tubing, the respiratory therapist asked and waited for green. Before moving her pillow, I asked. Before opening the shade over the door window, I asked. The smallest choices seemed unnecessary, until I remembered how many people had decided that Lark's body belonged to them. Her grandmother had decided who would drive. Her aunt had decided which story she would be expected to tell. Both of them had decided whether she should continue breathing. Now even opening a shade required her permission. 2 days after the pharmacy video confirmed Corinne had driven away with Lark in the car, Leah visited me at the hospital. She carried a thin legal folder and asked Elena to remain with Lark while we spoke in the consultation room. Both defense teams filed motions related to release conditions. Leah said. The prosecutor expects them to challenge how the hospital incident has been described. Odette's lawyer is still calling it an accident? He is calling it an acute trauma response. Corinne's attorney says she restrained you only because you were physically interfering. They know the video shows no staff in the room when she grabbed me. They know the camera does not show every angle inside the room. She opened the folder. They are also using some of your older messages. My stomach tightened. What messages? Leah slid copies across the table. The first was from 6 months earlier, after Lark had been home with pneumonia for more than a week. I am so tired, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this alone. I had sent it to Odette at 2 a.m. The second message came from the previous school year, after I missed a deadline at work because Lark needed an emergency dental appointment. Sometimes I feel like I am failing her at everything. The third was the message I sent Leah's office after the crash. I should have left work and picked her up myself. They are saying I wanted to hurt Lark? No. They are suggesting you were exhausted, emotionally overwhelmed, and carrying guilt before the ICU confrontation. Their argument is that those feelings affected how you interpreted a chaotic event. I watched Odette pull out the tube. I know. My wrists were bruised. I know. My mother admitted she held me. She disputes when and why. I looked at my own words on the copies. They were real. That was what made them dangerous. I had been tired. I had felt alone. I had believed I was failing Lark long before the accident. Corinne had spent my entire life finding a true weakness and building a false conclusion around it. Because I was exhausted, I could not be trusted. Because I felt guilty, I must be inventing blame. Because I regretted not collecting Lark myself, every fact I reported became revenge against the people I had trusted instead. For several seconds, I heard my mother's voice more clearly than Leah's. You bruise easily. You were hysterical. If you had collected your own child, none of this would have happened. What if a judge believes them? I asked. A judge will review the messages in context with the medical evidence, the witness statements, the video, and the equipment data. But people hear what they already expect to hear. Yes, Leah said. That is why the prosecutor presents evidence, not family consensus. I gathered the pages into a neat stack. What should I do? Do not explain these messages to your relatives. Do not contact either defendant. If the prosecution needs a statement about context, they will ask for one. I thought of the response I had deleted. Leah leaned closer. Your mother is trying to move this case into the place where she has always been strongest, private family interpretation. Do not follow her there. When I returned to Lark's room, she was asleep. My phone rested on the window ledge where Elena had placed it. The screen lit with another voicemail notification, but the sound remained muted. I turned the phone face down. That evening, Lark asked whether she could listen to music from my phone. I opened the playlist she used while drawing and placed the device on the tray table. The first song had barely begun when an incoming voicemail interrupted it. The speaker activated before I could reach the screen. Aunt Meredith's voice filled the room. Marin, everyone is trying to protect that child, but she only needs to say she remembers it wrong. Corinne should not go to prison because a frightened little girl mixed up where people were sitting. I stopped the recording. Lark was staring at me. Her face had gone still. I'm sorry, I said. You were not supposed to hear that. Grandma prison? I don't know what will happen. Because 6 words? No. She touched her throat. I said it. You said what you remembered. If I didn't say it, Grandma home? I moved my chair closer but waited before touching her hand. The police did not begin investigating because you said 6 words. They are investigating because Grandma drove when she was not allowed to, because they waited to call for help, because they changed their story, and because Aunt Odette hurt you in the hospital. Lark looked toward the red square on the board. I stopped talking. After a moment, she whispered, Maybe Aunt didn't switch. I kept my face still. You are allowed to be unsure. Maybe Grandma got out that side. That is possible to say if you are not sure. I saw circle wrong. You do not have to decide right now. Her eyes filled with tears. Tell police I wrong. I wanted to say she had not been wrong. I wanted to remind her that she had spoken without prompting, that Odette's face had changed before anyone explained what the words meant, and that the physical evidence supported the seating positions. But I also heard Tamsin's warning. Do not reward one answer and reject another. Do not make accuracy the price of safety. I will tell Tamsin exactly what you told me, I said. I will not add anything. Will Grandma come back if I change? No. The no contact order is not yours to change. Why? Because adults are responsible for keeping you safe. She looked at the board again. Green, she whispered. I took her hand. She cried without making much sound. I sat beside her and did not ask which memory was true. The next morning, Tamsin Cole met with me in a private room near the pediatric unit. I repeated Lark's words exactly. Maybe Aunt didn't switch. Maybe Grandma got out that side. Tell police. I wrong. Tamsin wrote Lark's new words without reacting. She explained that trauma could preserve sensory details while disrupting sequence, and that pressure from adults could change how a child described the same memory. Do not help her recover the version you believe is accurate, she said. Even reassurance can tell her which answer protects you. What do I say when she asks if she remembered wrong? That she may describe what she remembers today, including uncertainty. Adults will investigate the facts around her. Even if she remembers nothing else, she still deserves to be safe. I had treated Lark's memory as a doorway to the truth. Corinne and Odette had treated it as a threat. Tamsin was asking me to treat it as something belonging to Lark. From now on, no one discusses the crash with her unless you conduct the interview, I said. Her therapist may respond if Lark raises it, but no one should question her for details. She can ask to stop any conversation. I want that written into the care plan. We can do that. I returned to Lark's room and moved the red square from the board to the tray beside her hand. You can use this with me too, I said. She touched the card. If I ask something you do not want to answer, show me red. Your mom. That does not mean I get every answer. She studied my face. Even crash? Especially the crash. For the first time since waking, Lark placed the red card between us without fear. I nodded. Okay. Then she moved it back to the side. The investigation did lose something. Keene told me Lark's uncertainty would have to be disclosed to the defense. Her first statement did not disappear, but no prosecutor could pretend the later change had not happened. We expected memory questions, he said. That is why the physical evidence matters. Do you still believe they switched seats? My belief is not the standard. The evidence still supports Corinne driving, and Odette being in the passenger position at impact. The later seat movement remains an investigative inference. So Meredith's voicemail helped them. It created pressure on a child witness. It also gave us a record of the family campaign around her. Will she be charged? Not for leaving an irresponsible voicemail, but she has been instructed not to contact you or Lark about the case. I hated how carefully the truth had to move while a lie could cross the family in minutes. By the end of the week, every relative seemed to know the messages I had once sent Odette about being tired. They quoted them without dates and without the nights that had produced them. She said she could not keep doing it. She admitted she was failing the child. She blamed herself before she blamed anyone else. Corinne's version did not need to prove I had lied. It only needed to make people uncomfortable enough to stop asking what she and Odette had done. I stopped reading. Every communication went through Leah or Keene. I documented the calls. I kept the red card within Lark's reach. Silence became the first boundary Corinne could not reinterpret because I gave her no words to use. On Friday afternoon, Leah called and asked me to meet her in the hospital conference room. She arrived, carrying no folder this time. Odette's attorney requested a protected cooperation meeting, she said. What does that mean? She offered information to the prosecutor through her attorney. It is an attempt to explore cooperation. It is not a plea agreement, and nothing she said automatically earns leniency. Was Corinne's lawyer there? No. Their legal interests are now directly opposed. I had known the fracture was coming. Still, hearing it made something inside me shift. What did Odette say? I cannot give you the complete account. I can share the portions the prosecutor approved because they affect your safety, Lark's protection, and your understanding of the ICU incident. Leah sat across from me. Odette says Corinne has prepared a written account in which Odette acted alone at the hospital. According to that account, Corinne did not know Odette intended to touch the breathing tube. Corinne claims she restrained you only after the alarm because you became physically aggressive. She is sacrificing Odette. That is how Odette now describes it. Now, yes. What else? Odette says Corinne told her that if Lark woke and remembered, both their lives would be over. The deleted message. The statement is consistent with the recovered fragment, but investigators are still working to determine when and where the conversation occurred. Did Mom tell her to pull the tube? Odette did not claim Corinne used those words. I waited. Leah continued. Odette says Corinne spoke repeatedly about Lark waking, the DMV suspension, the medication, and the consequences of the crash investigation reopening. Odette says she became convinced there was no path back. There were many paths back. I agree. She could have told the truth at the roadside. She could have told the police. She could have walked out of Lark's room. The prosecutor asked her that. What did she say? She said that after the crash, each lie made the next choice feel smaller. By the time she approached Lark's bed, she believed the truth would destroy everyone. I looked through the glass wall toward the corridor. Did she apologize? No. Did she say Lark's name? Only while describing the events. Did she admit she pulled the tube? She admitted placing her hands on the securing device and causing the tube to come out. Her attorney continues to dispute that she intended Lark's death. She called it mercy. She says she was repeating what Corinne had told her about machines prolonging suffering. The old structure remained, even while Odette tried to escape it. Corinne gave her the belief. Corinne created the fear. Corinne manipulated her. Every sentence moved Odette's hand farther from the tube. What does she want? I asked. To provide information about Corinne in exchange for consideration during charging and sentencing. What does the prosecutor want from me? Nothing right now. You have the right to express your views, but the state decides whether cooperation is useful. My view is that telling the truth after your mother prepares to blame you is not the same as taking responsibility. I will convey that. If she wants leniency, she should start by saying what she did without attaching Mom to every verb. Leah nodded. There is one more approved statement. She removed a single page from her bag. It was not the full account, only a summary prepared for victim notification. Leah read the final paragraph aloud. Odette stated that when she approached the child's bed, Corinne understood what was about to happen. Odette said, Mom didn't hold Marin to save the girl. She held her because she knew what I was about to do. The room seemed to narrow around the sentence. For weeks, Corinne had claimed she restrained me to protect the medical team. Odette had finally named the truth. My mother did not misunderstand the moment. She chose a side before the alarm sounded. And when Lark stopped breathing, Corinne chose the person pulling the tube. 5 weeks after Lark's first forensic interview, she asked to speak with Tamsin Cole again. The request did not come from Detective Keene, the district attorney, or me. Lark told her trauma therapist that she had begun remembering sounds from the crash and wanted someone to record them before they disappeared. Her therapist contacted Tamsin without asking Lark for details. Tamsin then met with Lark privately to make sure the request belonged to her. Only after that did anyone call me. By then, Lark had left the hospital and entered an inpatient rehabilitation program 20 minutes from our townhouse. She could walk slowly without assistance, but sudden movement still made her dizzy. Her voice had almost returned to normal, although it became thin when she was tired. She no longer needed oxygen during the day. At night, she sometimes woke with both hands around her throat. The supplemental interview took place in a child advocacy center rather than a police station. The room had pale walls, soft chairs, and a low table covered with blank paper, pencils, and small wooden figures. No uniformed officer entered. No family photographs were visible. Nothing in the room told Lark which answer anyone hoped to hear. Tamsin met us in the lobby. "You asked to come back," she said to Lark. "That means you also get to decide when we stop." Lark nodded. "You can say you do not remember. You can correct yourself. You can ask for a break. You can leave before we finish. Can Mom come in?" Tamsin glanced at me, but directed the answer to Lark. "She can if that is what you want. The recording will show that she was present. Some children find it easier to talk without a parent in the room." Lark looked at me. I waited. For most of her life, adults had answered silence for her. Corinne called hesitation shyness. Odette called it stubbornness. I had often rushed to rescue Lark from the discomfort of choosing. This time I kept my mouth closed. "I want Mom outside," she said. The sentence hurt and healed something at the same time. "Okay," I said. Lark reached for the red card she carried in the pocket of her sweatshirt. It was the same signal she had used in the hospital when she wanted people to stop. She placed it on the table beside the door. "Can I use this?" "Anytime," Tamsin said. I watched them enter the interview room. The door closed, and I sat in the hallway with Leah Morales. There was no viewing screen for me. No speaker. No way to know what was being said behind the wall. That was deliberate. Lark's memory did not belong to my need for answers. The interview lasted 53 minutes. When the door opened, Lark came out carrying a large sheet of paper against her chest. Her face looked exhausted, but she was not crying. "Can we get hot chocolate?" she asked. "Yes." Tamsin asked me to join her in a private office, while Leah took Lark to the center's kitchen. The interview was recorded, Tamsin said. Lark chose to continue after one break. She used the red card once, then asked to return. What did she remember? "I can give you a limited summary because you are her parent, and because some of the information affects her care. Detective Keene will explain what can be shared about the investigation." I folded my hands in my lap. She did not provide a continuous story, Tamsin said. She created a sound map. That made sense before Tamsin showed it to me. Lark had drawn 3 boxes to represent the car seats. She placed herself in the rear passenger position. She marked the front left seat with a dark rose-colored circle and the front right seat with a blue one. Beside the front left circle, she had drawn a short black line. She said that was the sound of a seatbelt clicking on the left front side. Tamsin explained. Near the center of the page were 3 red marks. She remembered 3 warning chimes after the crash. She associated them with a door being open or a seatbelt being released. Another line stretched backward from the front left seat. She described a mechanical sliding sound after the vehicle had stopped. The driver's seat moving. That is your interpretation. Lark described a sound like a chair moving backward on a track. I nodded. Tamsin pointed to words written in her own handwriting beside the front right position. "Mom, move." Lark remembers Odette's voice coming from the right front side, she said. She remembers Odette saying those words after the impact. Did she say Corinne was in the driver's seat? She said the smell she associates with Corinne was strongest near the front left area. Rose perfume. And medicine. She described a bitter smell from the pharmacy bag and your mother's perfume together. I looked at Lark's page again. The sound map did not accuse anyone. It did not contain a perfect sequence. It placed sounds, smells, and voices where her body remembered them. The click on the left? Odette's voice on the right. The seat sliding after the car had stopped. What happened when she used the red card? I asked. Tamsin's expression became more careful. She began remembering what was said after the collision. My chest tightened. What did they tell her? Lark said. Corinne told her that if the police learned she had been driving, Corinne would disappear, and you would have no family left. I looked toward the office door. Lark was on the other side, drinking hot chocolate. She put that on a 10-year-old child. Yes. What did Odette say? Lark remembers Odette telling her that if she woke up later, she should say she did not remember anything. I pressed my palms together. until the bones in my fingers hurt. Did they know she was conscious? Lark described being unable to open her eyes fully or move, but hearing their voices. She did not know whether they realized she could hear. The 7 minutes changed again. Corinne and Odette had not only changed seats and delayed help, they had begun shaping Lark's silence while she lay injured behind them. What did Lark do after remembering that? I asked. She asked whether telling the truth would make her grandmother disappear. What did you tell her? That adults are responsible for adult choices. Tamsin turned the page. Then she used the red card and asked to stop. She should have stopped. She did. But you said she returned. After several minutes, she asked whether the recording would remain unfinished if she left. I told her unfinished was allowed. She said she wanted to add one more thing. What was it? She remembered Odette touching her shoulder at the pharmacy after Corinne took the keys. Lark said she did not know the phrase "not safe." She only knew she did not want to get back into the car. My throat closed. The message appeared in my mind exactly as it had on my phone. Mom, can you get me instead? Not because Lark wanted extra time with me. Not because she had changed her mind about pickup. She had seen Corinne take the keys. She had tried to warn me with the only words she had. I had answered as though she were asking me to rearrange a calendar. Does she know I read the message? I asked. She knows you received it. She asked whether you understood what she meant. What did you say? That she should ask you when she felt ready. Lark did not mention the interview during the drive back to rehabilitation. She held the cup of hot chocolate with both hands and watched the buildings pass outside the window. I did not ask whether she wanted to talk. Halfway there, she said, "You saw my text." "Yes." "You said Grandma and Aunt were coming." "Yes." "Why didn't you come?" There was no answer that could protect me without placing the cost back on her. I pulled into a quiet parking lot and turned off the engine. "I was at work," I said. "I saw your message and thought you wanted me to change the pickup plan. I did not ask why." "You were busy." "I was. But being busy did not stop me from asking one question." Lark stared down at the lid of her cup. "I didn't say Grandma was driving." "No. I didn't know yet." "What did you know?" "That Aunt gave her keys." Her voice became smaller. "And Grandma took medicine. The pharmacy lady said no driving." I heard. I waited. Lark traced one finger around the rim of the cup. I thought maybe Aunt would say no. She should have. Then Grandma looked mad. What did that make you feel? Like if I said no too, everyone would be mad. I closed my eyes for 1 second. Corinne had spent decades making refusal feel like cruelty. Lark had understood that system before she understood the language to describe it. "I should have asked why you wanted me," I said. "You didn't know." "I knew you were asking. I chose not to ask what was underneath it." Lark looked at me. "I am sorry." She did not tell me it was okay. She did not reach across the console to comfort me. I was grateful. An apology that requires the injured person to relieve your guilt is another form of taking. "I didn't know how to say unsafe," she said. "You should not have needed the perfect word." "What word should I use now?" "You can say no. You can say stop. You can say come get me. You can send a red square. You can say nothing except my name. And I will ask what you need." "What if you're working?" "I will still ask." She turned toward the window again. After a while, she said, "Can we go back now?" I started the engine. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. It changed the meaning of every choice I made afterward. Before the crash, I believed listening meant waiting until Lark gave me a complete explanation. Afterward, I understood that children often speak from the edge of a fear they cannot yet name. My responsibility was not to guess every danger. It was to stop treating incomplete language as unimportant. 2 days later, Detective Keene and Leah met me at the district attorney's office. The data extraction from Odette's phone had been completed under a search warrant. Keene reminded me that he could only share information approved by the prosecutor. He placed a timeline on the table. At 7:31 on the night of the ICU attack, Odette searched for the likelihood of memory returning after traumatic brain injury. At 7:36, she searched how long a patient might take to wake after sedation was reduced. At 7:41, she opened a medical page about memory fragments after head trauma. At 7:43, a message appeared in the synchronized thread investigators had partially recovered. The preliminary extraction still could not identify which phone sent it. If she wakes and remembers, both our lives. The sentence remained incomplete in the extraction Keen was permitted to show me. At 7:47, Odette searched the effects of oxygen loss on brain function. At 7:49, she searched how quickly lack of oxygen could cause permanent damage. At 7:52, she opened the hospital's visitor information page, including a section on ICU access and nursing stations. At 7:54, Dr. Nadim entered Lark's room and told us that she might begin waking that night. At 8:13, the hallway video showed Odette checking the nurse's station. At 8:14, she pulled out Lark's breathing tube. I read the timeline once, then again. The searches removed the last place where Odette had hidden inside the word panic. Panic was immediate. This had steps. Question. Search. Message. Another search. A look into the hallway. A hand on the tube. She researched oxygen loss before she touched Lark, I said. Yes. Her attorney said she believed the machines were prolonging suffering. The search history does not show her looking for end-of-life standards, brain death, medical futility, withdrawal of treatment, or comfort care. What did she search? How memory returns. When patients wake, what oxygen loss does to the brain. The difference was so clear that it felt physical. Odette had not been trying to understand whether Lark was suffering. She had been trying to understand whether Lark could speak, and how quickly silence could become permanent. Did Corinne know about the searches? I asked. We cannot establish that from the searches alone. What about the message? The recovered data shows Odette opened a message thread with Corinne immediately before the oxygen-related searches. We are still working with the backup records. I remembered Corinne's hands locking around my wrists. She knew enough. Keen did not agree or disagree. The prosecution will prove what the evidence supports. He showed me one more item. Odette had taken a screenshot of a medical article stating that patients emerging from sedation could speak in brief phrases before they could sustain a full conversation. The screenshot was created at 7:40. 6 words. Lark had only managed 6 words the next morning. Odette had feared a voice that did not need a full story. She had understood that one sentence could be enough. Does Lark need to know about these searches? I asked. No, Leah said. Not now. This is evidence for adults to carry. The phrase settled over me. Adults to carry. For weeks, every person in my family had tried to place the consequences on Lark. Corinne told her that speaking would make her grandmother disappear. Odette told her to claim she remembered nothing. Meredith told her that one changed memory could save Corinne from prison. Even I had looked at Lark's words and silently begged them to remain consistent enough to hold up a case. The search history changed that. Lark did not need to prove why Odette approached her bed. Odette's own phone had recorded the path. I returned to rehabilitation before dinner. Lark was in the activity room, drawing a sound map of the courtyard. She had marked a fountain with blue loops, a wheelchair passing over concrete with gray dots, and 2 birds with small yellow marks. I sat beside her. Did police say I was right? She asked. I chose my words carefully. They found information that helps them understand what the adults did. My sounds? Your sounds help them know where to look. She placed her pencil down. What if I forget again? Then you forget. What if I remember different? You tell Tamsin if you want to. Or you say you do not want to talk. Will they still know? The adults have evidence. You are not carrying the whole case. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she picked up the red pencil and added 1 mark beside the courtyard door. What sound is that? I asked. It's the lock. Does that sound feel safe or scary? Lark considered it. Both. I nodded. A lock could keep someone inside. It could also keep danger out. The meaning depended on who controlled the door. That night, Detective Keene called after Lark had gone to sleep. The prosecutor had approved one final statement for victim notification. The 6 words Lark spoke opened the door, he said. Odette's phone just told us why she wanted that door closed. By the time the amended charges had been filed and the final plea negotiations began, in mid-March 2026, Corinne and Odette were no longer telling the same story. For most of my life, my mother had decided which version of every conflict would survive. Odette accepted the version that protected her. Now each woman had separate counsel, a separate proffer, and a reason to make the other responsible. Leah Morales asked me to come to the district attorney's office on a Thursday morning. Lark remained at rehabilitation with her therapist. I told her I had a meeting about the adults case and that she did not need to know anything unless it affected her safety. She accepted that answer more easily than I did. The meeting took place in a windowless conference room. Leah sat beside me. Detective Keene sat across from us with Deputy District Attorney Evelyn Hart, the prosecutor assigned to both the crash and ICU cases. Hart began by explaining what I was allowed to know. Some evidence had appeared in public court filings. Some could be shared with me because I was Lark's parent and a victim in the hospital assault. Other information remained protected until the defendants entered their pleas. "You will not receive the complete investigative file," she said. "I do not want you later wondering whether someone kept a secret from you. There are things we are legally and ethically required not to disclose yet." "I understand. We can show you the factual timeline supporting the amended charges and explain the separate offers made to each defendant." Keene placed the completed timeline on the table. The pharmacy video, airbags, restraint fibers, bruises, DMV suspension, toxicology, vehicle data, and Daniel Price independently established the crash reconstruction. None of it depended on Lark remembering a seat. The hospital sequence was just as clear. Odette researched memory recovery, short speech after sedation, oxygen loss, and ICU access before checking the nurse's station and removing the tube. The ventilator marked the sudden pressure loss, while Corinne held my arms, and neither woman called for help. Hart tapped Lark's 6 words at the center of the page. "They made us reopen the collision urgently. They did not create the evidence." And the hospital attack? The medical findings, the ventilator data, the video, your injuries, the witness accounts, and Odette's search history support the intent allegations. What about Corinne? That is where their accounts separate. Hart opened a different folder. Corinne's attorney had submitted a proffer describing Odette as emotionally unstable after the crash. Corinne claimed she had watched her older daughter unravel for 2 days and had worried that Odette might harm herself. According to Corinne's version, she did not know Odette intended to touch the breathing tube. She said she was across the room when Odette moved toward Lark, heard the alarm, and grabbed me because I became violent and blocked the medical staff. "She is still saying she held me after the alarm," I said. "Yes. She grabbed me before anyone came through the door. That is supported by your original statement and by the position of everyone when staff arrived." Hart showed me a still image from the hallway camera. The frame captured only part of the room, but Corinne stood behind me with both arms extended. Odette remained at the head of the bed. The first nurse had not yet crossed the threshold. The next still was less than 2 seconds later. The nurse entered. Corinne's hands were still around my wrists. The third still showed the respiratory therapist arriving. Only then did Corinne release me. Hart placed the photographs of my bruises beside the images. "Corinne's attorney describes her contact with you as a momentary protective reflex," Hart said. "The video shows that the restraint continued while the emergency developed. She did not press the call button. She did not shout for staff. She did not attempt to move Odette away from the patient. She helped her. That is the state's allegation." "What does Corinne say about the sentence in the consultation room?" "Her attorney claims the words, 'stupid prank,' were an emotional attempt to calm you, not an admission that she understood what Odette had done. She asked me not to report it." "Yes, the security officer heard the complete statement." Corinne had spent weeks preparing a version in which she remained the responsible person in the room. Odette was unstable. I was hysterical. Corinne had stood between two out-of-control daughters and tried to preserve order. It was the role she had assigned herself in every family disaster. The difference was that this time, the room had cameras, witnesses, medical logs, and bruises. Her language could not remove her hands from my wrists. Hart closed Corinne's folder and opened Odette's. Odette's proffer takes a different position, she said. Leah glanced at me before Hart continued. Odette admitted that Corinne had been driving at the time of the crash. She admitted moving into the driver's seat after impact and allowing Corinne to tell police about the black SUV. She admitted that she did not call 911 during the 7-minute delay. She also admitted that she knew Lark was improving before she approached the breathing tube. Did she admit why she removed it? I asked. She states that she believed Lark would identify both of them and that the consequences would destroy their lives. The room seemed to become quieter. Does she still call it mercy? Her attorney argues that Corinne repeatedly described the machines as prolonging Lark's suffering. Odette says those statements affected her thinking. Her phone shows what affected her thinking. Yes, she searched memory and oxygen loss. She did not search whether Lark was dying. That distinction is included in the state's factual analysis. Odette had provided access to a cloud backup connected to the phone investigators had already searched. Her attorney said the backup contained exchanges Corinne had deleted from her own device. In return, Odette wanted the prosecutor to consider her cooperation. She is giving you my mother, I said. She is providing evidence she believes strengthens the case against Corinne, because Corinne tried to give you Odette first. Hart did not disagree. Each defendant is now acting in her own legal interest. That was the careful version. The truth was simpler. The moment protection stopped flowing from Corinne to Odette, loyalty disappeared. For decades, my sister had believed our mother's love meant never facing consequences alone. Corinne had believed Odette's dependence meant she would always accept the blame Corinne assigned. Now both women had discovered that their bond survived only while someone weaker paid the price. First, that person had been me. Then it had been Lark. When the law removed us from reach, they turned toward each other. Hart took a single printed page from the file. The backup allowed investigators to recover the complete message sent at 7:43. I already knew the first words. If she wakes and remembers, both our lives. Hart read the entire message. If she wakes and remembers, both our lives are over. You know what has to happen. For several seconds, I heard nothing after the final word. The message did not say breathing tube. It did not say kill her. It did not contain an instruction that could stand alone and explain every movement in the ICU. But Corinne had written about what had to happen. Odette had answered with searches about oxygen loss. Then she checked the hallway. Then she pulled the tube. And when I tried to reach Lark, Corinne held me. Who sent it? I asked, though I understood from Hart's wording. Corinne sent it to Odette. The partial extraction Keane first showed me had preserved the words, but not the originating device. The cloud backup now preserved the sender information. Corinne had sent the message from her own phone. My mother had written the sentence 11 minutes before Dr. Nadim formally told us Lark might wake. How did she know? I asked. Hospital records show a resident spoke with Corinne in the hallway, shortly before 7:43. He told her the team was encouraged by Lark's responses and was reducing sedation. He did not discuss memory, but Corinne knew waking was becoming likely. She went directly from that conversation to the message. Yes. Did Odette answer? Hart placed another line beneath the first. Odette's reply had been sent less than a minute later. I know. 2 words. No question. No surprise. No refusal. Hart explained that the message was not the only basis for the aiding allegation against Corinne. Its meaning came from the actions around it. Corinne learned Lark was improving. She warned Odette that both their lives would be over. She wrote that Odette knew what had to happen. Odette searched the effects of oxygen deprivation. Odette approached the bed. Corinne watched her. Corinne restrained me before staff entered. Afterward, she told me not to report Odette. Then she instructed my sister to claim Lark had removed the tube herself. Can Corinne still say she meant something else? I asked. She can say she meant they needed to speak with attorneys, prepare for police, or persuade Lark not to discuss the crash. The court evaluates the message with the conduct that followed. She knew. The state believes the evidence proves she understood what Odette intended when she restrained you. I looked at the image of Corinne behind me. For weeks, I had tried to locate the exact moment she could have chosen differently. Maybe she did not understand when Odette first moved toward the bed. Maybe she thought my sister was adjusting Lark's hair. Maybe her body reacted before her mind understood. The message removed those last excuses. My mother had entered the room knowing that Lark's voice threatened her freedom. She had watched Odette study the machines. When Odette reached for the tube, Corinne did not need an explanation. She had already supplied the reason. Hart allowed me several minutes before moving to the plea offers. The state had made separate offers because the defendants faced different charges and different levels of responsibility. Odette would plead guilty to attempted murder, dissuading a witness, evidence tampering related to the collision, and leaving an injured child without timely aid. The negotiated aggregate sentence was 18 years in state prison. The factual admission would state that she intentionally removed Lark's airway to prevent her from revealing what happened in the crash. Corinne would plead guilty to felony drug-impaired driving, causing great bodily injury, child endangerment, evidence tampering, and aiding the ICU assault. Her negotiated aggregate sentence was 11 years. Her factual admission would state that she knew Odette intended to interfere with Lark's breathing and restrained me to prevent intervention. The judge must still accept each agreement, Hart said. Both defendants must admit the factual basis under oath. The court must confirm that their pleas are voluntary and that they understand the trial rights they are giving up. Will Lark have to appear? No. Will she have to answer questions from their lawyers? No. Will the recorded forensic interviews be played? Only if the court requires clarification of the factual basis, which we do not expect. The physical evidence, the admissions, and the stipulated records are sufficient. What happens if one of them refuses at the hearing? The agreement with that defendant ends, and the case proceeds through ordinary litigation. But both defense teams have indicated acceptance. Leah placed her hand near mine without touching it. The prosecutor is asking for your view, she said. The decision belongs to the state, and the judge must approve it, but your position matters. 18 years. 11 years. Part of me wanted more. I saw Lark's body jerk when the tube came out. I heard Corinne whisper that it was a prank. I remembered the 7 minutes when my child lay unconscious while they rearranged the car. No number could contain all of that. I asked what a full trial would require. Hart answered honestly. Lark's statements could be challenged. Her changing memory would become part of the defense. Lawyers could argue about whether relatives influenced her, whether her head injury affected sequence, and whether her 6 words had been interpreted too broadly. The state could seek protective procedures, but no prosecutor could promise Lark would remain untouched by the process. The trial could also take another year or longer. What would a longer sentence give her? Leah asked quietly. I knew what she meant. Not what it would give me. What it would give Lark. Nothing. Lark did not need to watch strangers debate whether her memories were clean enough. She did not need Corinne's attorney repeating that a frightened child mixed up the seats. She did not need Odette's lawyer turning my daughter's uncertainty into mercy for the woman who tried to silence her. The evidence had already carried what Lark should never have been asked to carry alone. I support the agreements, I said. Hart nodded. I need something included in the factual basis. What? That Lark's words did not create these crimes. They revealed them. Hart wrote it down. I also want the protective orders to continue for the maximum period the court can impose. They will be part of both agreements. No letters through relatives. No messages through anyone else. No requests for forgiveness sent to her when she is older. We can ask for language prohibiting direct and indirect contact. I looked again at the 2 proposed sentences. I am not choosing 18 years or 11 years because I think that measures what they did, I said. I am choosing the path that does not require Lark to be harmed again to prove she was harmed the first time. Hart closed the files. Before we left, Leah asked whether I was ready to begin my victim impact statement. I had spent months recording dates, messages, injuries, searches, and contradictions. I had pages describing what Corinne and Odette had done. But the statement could not become another place where Lark disappeared behind the adult's consequences. Leah opened her notebook. "What do you want the court to understand?" she asked. I looked at the complete message one last time. You know what has to happen. Corinne had believed protecting herself required Lark's silence. Odette had believed protecting their lie required taking away her breath. Our relatives had believed protecting the family required changing a child's memory. Every version asked Lark to pay. I want the court to call what they did by its right name, I said. I do not want my child to pay one more price for that to happen. 3 days before the plea hearing, Leah Morales called to tell me both defense teams had sent final requests. She did not read them over the phone. She asked me to come to the district attorney's office because each request involved changing the factual statements that would be presented to the judge. By then, Lark had returned home from inpatient rehabilitation. She attended physical therapy 3 mornings a week and trauma counseling every Thursday. I arranged for our neighbor to stay with her while I met Leah. Lark knew there would be a court hearing. She knew Corinne and Odette planned to admit what they had done. She did not know the details of the sentence negotiations, the legal arguments about intent, or the words their lawyers were still trying to soften. Those belonged to adults. Leah placed 2 letters on the table. The first came from Corinne's attorney. He asked whether I would sign a statement, saying Corinne restrained me during a moment of confusion and believed she was preventing me from interfering with emergency care. The proposed sentence did not say Corinne had held me after medical staff entered. It did not say she grabbed me while Odette stood beside Lark's bed. It simply said the room was chaotic, and Corinne reacted instinctively. They want me to erase the order of events, I said. They want mitigation language they can use at sentencing. The order is the event. Leah nodded. If Corinne grabbed me after nurses entered, she was a frightened mother trying to control a chaotic room. If she grabbed me before they entered, while Lark could not breathe, she was preventing me from saving my child. 1 second changed everything. That was why Corinne had spent 6 months trying to move it. The second request came from Odette's attorney. He asked whether I would state that Odette appeared emotionally overwhelmed and believed the breathing machine was prolonging Lark's pain. The proposed language described her actions as a desperate attempt to end suffering. It did not mention the memory searches. It did not mention the oxygen deprivation searches. It did not mention the saved article about patients speaking in brief phrases. It did not mention her eyes checking the nurse's station before she touched the tube. They want me to repeat her sentence, I said. The machines aren't saving her, Leah said quietly. They want that sentence to become medical judgment instead of an excuse. The prosecutor will not change the factual basis. Dr. Nadim's statement makes clear there was no end-of-life decision, no diagnosis of brain death, and no plan to withdraw support. Then why ask me? Because a victim saying she understood the act as panic or misguided compassion could influence how the judge views mitigation. I pushed both letters away. No, you do not have to answer today. I already answered in the ICU. I saw what happened. Leah folded her hands. There is one more item. She removed a handwritten letter from a separate envelope. The writing belonged to Corinne. My mother began by telling me she loved Lark. She wrote that she had replayed the hospital scene every night and wished she had made different choices. For half a paragraph, the letter almost resembled an apology. Then, the direction changed. Corinne wrote that prison would remove both a grandmother and an aunt from Lark's life. She said children often carried lifelong guilt when their testimony sent relatives away. She warned that one day Lark might understand the consequences of her 6 words and blame herself. The last sentence asked me to protect my daughter from that burden by correcting the record before the hearing. I placed the letter flat on the table. She is still asking Lark to save her. She is asking you to change your statement. No. She is asking me to teach Lark that the truth becomes wrong when it hurts the person who caused the harm. Leah waited while I read the final paragraph again. Corinne had not asked whether Lark still woke holding her throat. She had not mentioned the red card beside Lark's bed. She had not named the 7 minutes before Daniel Price called 911. Her fear remained centered on what Lark might feel about Corinne's punishment, not what Lark already felt about nearly dying. I took out a pen and wrote my answer beneath Leah's notes. My mother is not asking me to save our family. She is asking me to sacrifice Lark one more time. Leah looked at the sentence. Do you want this included in your victim impact statement? Yes. I declined both requests in writing. I would not say Corinne restrained me after the alarm. I would not say Odette acted out of compassion. I would not ask Lark to write a letter, forgive anyone, appear in court, or provide comfort to the adults who had tried to turn her voice into a weapon against herself. The next 2 days, I worked on my statement at the kitchen table after Lark went to sleep. My first draft was 12 pages. It contained every call Corinne made before asking about Lark, every relative who described attempted murder as a mistake, every date, timestamp, search term, and contradiction. When I read it the following morning, I realized I had written a case summary. The prosecutor already had evidence. The judge already had reports. My statement needed to explain what the evidence could not measure. It needed to explain why Lark sat facing every doorway. Why she asked permission before closing a car door. Why she stopped breathing normally whenever someone reached near her throat. Why the words family and safe no longer belonged automatically in the same sentence. I reduced the statement to 4 pages. I did not request the longest possible punishment. The negotiated sentences were already part of the agreements. The judge could accept or reject them, but my anger did not decide the numbers. I wrote instead that I supported the guilty pleas because they allowed the truth to be stated publicly without requiring Lark to defend her memory under hostile questioning. I wrote that protection was not measured by how much pain I could force my daughter to endure in order to produce a harsher sentence. On April 17, 2026, I entered the Sacramento County Courthouse with Leah beside me. Both defendants had waived separate sentencing dates, so the judge would move directly from each accepted plea into the agreed sentencing hearing. The morning sky was clear, but the courthouse hallway felt windowless and cold. Deputies moved people between courtrooms. Attorneys spoke in low voices near the elevators. Odette's hearing was scheduled first. She entered through a side door wearing county jail clothing beneath a dark cardigan provided for court. Her hair was shorter than I remembered. She looked toward the benches and found me immediately. I did not look away. The judge reviewed the trial rights Odette was giving up, including the rights to remain silent, confront witnesses, and require the state to prove every charge. She answered yes each time. Her voice shook only when he asked whether anyone had threatened or forced her to accept the agreement. No, Your Honor. The prosecutor read the factual basis. Odette knew Lark could regain consciousness and memory. She searched for information about memory recovery and oxygen deprivation. She intentionally removed a secured breathing tube from a 10-year-old child. She did so to prevent Lark from identifying the adults involved in staging the collision. She delayed emergency aid after the crash and participated in altering the seating positions before police arrived. The judge turned to Odette. Are those facts true? Odette's attorney whispered something to her. She closed her eyes. Yes. Did you intentionally cause the breathing tube to be removed? Yes. Did you understand that removing it could cause the child's death? Odette's mouth tightened. Yes. Was your purpose to prevent her from speaking about the collision? A long pause followed. Yes. The word was almost inaudible. The judge asked her to repeat it. Yes, Your Honor. Her attorney described Corinne's control and Odette's lifelong dependence on her approval. The prosecutor accepted that influence existed, but argued it did not move Odette's hand by itself. The search history, hallway video, ventilator log, and Dr. Nadim's statement showed that no physician considered treatment futile. The machines were supporting an injured child who was improving. The prosecutor read Odette's sentence from the ICU. The machines aren't saving her. They're only keeping her suffering alive. Then she read the medical conclusion. Lark was expected to wake. The contrast removed every trace of mercy from the words. They became what they had always been. Permission Odette had given herself. When it was my turn, I stood behind the lectern with my statement in both hands. I did not look at Odette until I reached Lark's name. My daughter's first request was not for punishment, I said. It was for safety. She wanted to know who could enter her room. She wanted to know who controlled the door. She wanted to know whether she was allowed to say stop. Odette lowered her eyes. I support this agreement because Lark should not have to enter this courtroom and prove her pain again. Her 6 words did not create these crimes. They revealed choices that had already been made by adults. I told the judge I would not call the tube removal compassion. Compassion would have pressed the call button. Compassion would have protected Lark's airway. Compassion would have told the truth at the roadside while a child waited for help. I finished without asking Odette to look at me. The judge accepted the plea. He imposed the negotiated aggregate sentence of 18 years in state prison and issued a criminal protective order prohibiting direct or indirect contact with Lark. No letters. No messages through relatives. No requests delivered when she became older. Odette began crying when the order was read. I felt no victory. Only relief that Lark's name had been removed from Odette's reach. Corinne's hearing took place that afternoon. She entered wearing the navy suit she had worn at our earlier meeting. Her silver hair was pinned neatly behind her head. She looked less like a criminal defendant than a woman arriving to correct someone else's paperwork. That illusion lasted until the judge began asking questions. Corinne admitted she drove while her license was suspended. She admitted she had taken medication after being warned not to drive. She admitted the car struck the guardrail while she was behind the wheel. She admitted moving from the driver's side after the crash and allowing Odette to claim she had been driving. She admitted no one in the family called 911 during the 7 minutes before Daniel Price arrived. Then the judge reached the ICU assault. Did you know Odette intended to interfere with the child's breathing tube? Corinne's attorney asked for a moment. They spoke quietly. Corinne faced forward again. I knew she intended to stop Lark from speaking. That was not my question. Corinne's lips pressed together. Yes. Did you restrain Marin to prevent her from stopping Odette? I held Marin during a chaotic situation. The prosecutor rose. The judge looked at Corinne. The factual basis requires a clear answer. Did you hold Marin before medical staff entered because you knew she would attempt to stop Odette? Corinne glanced toward her attorney. Yes. Did you understand the child could die? Corinne took a breath. Yes. The prosecutor presented the complete message. If she wakes and remembers, both our lives are over. You know what has to happen. She presented the hallway images showing Corinne's hands around my wrists before the first nurse entered. She presented the security officer's statement from the consultation room. Don't report your sister. It was a stupid prank. Corinne's attorney argued that the word prank came from shock. He said Corinne had been trying to prevent the family from making irreversible decisions while everyone was overwhelmed. The prosecutor answered with the family messages Corinne had sent afterward. She called the crash a misunderstanding. She called the seat change confusion. She called the tube removal panic. She called my account hysteria. Each time evidence named an action, Corinne found a softer word and placed it over the victim. This was not one panicked phrase, the prosecutor said. It was a method. When I approached the lectern, Corinne looked at me as though she still expected the private rules of our family to follow us into court. I read the sentence I had written in Leah's office. My mother is not asking me to save our family. She is asking me to sacrifice Lark one more time. Corinne's face changed. I continued. She wants me to change the moment she grabbed my arms. She wants me to change why my sister touched the tube. She wants Lark to believe that telling the truth caused this courtroom. I looked directly at her. Lark did not create these consequences. You did. I told the judge that Corinne had spent years teaching us that family loyalty meant absorbing harm quietly. I said the pattern ended when she chose to hold me while my child fought for air. I do not ask the court to punish her because she is my mother, I said. I ask the court not to excuse her because she is my mother. The judge accepted Corinne's plea. He imposed the negotiated aggregate sentence of 11 years in state prison. Her license was revoked, and any future request for reinstatement would require a new DMV medical review after her release. The criminal protective order prohibited all direct and indirect contact with Lark. Before concluding, the judge addressed both defendants. The child's words did not place you here. Your choices did. The collision, the delay in aid, the false report, the interference with her breathing, and the effort to silence her existed before she spoke. The courtroom remained silent. There was no applause. No one smiled. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined during sleepless nights at the hospital. I felt my lungs release a breath I had been holding since October. The deputies moved Odette toward one side door and Corinne toward another. As Corinne reached the doorway, she turned. Marin. Her voice carried across the courtroom, with the same authority it had used to stop arguments, rewrite memories, and call cruelty protection. I kept my eyes on the empty witness chair. Marin, please. I did not turn around. For once, hearing my name did not create an obligation. That evening, I returned to Lark's rehabilitation center. She had one final outpatient assessment before transitioning fully to home-based therapy. I found her in the activity room, drawing a map of sounds from the hallway. She had marked the wheels of a medication cart, the elevator bell, and the soft click of a door locking. When she saw me, she placed the pencil down. Court done? Yes. Grandma and Aunt gone? They are going to prison. Lark stared at the paper and touched the red mark beside the door. Did I make them disappear? I pulled a chair beside her and sat, so our eyes were level. No. Then why are they gone? Because Grandma chose to drive when she was not allowed. Because they waited instead of calling for help. Because they changed seats and lied. Because Aunt Odette pulled out your breathing tube. Because Grandma held me, so I could not stop her. Lark listened without moving. They made one choice after another, I said. You did not make them disappear. They walked away from us with every choice they made. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. Will they come back? Not to you. The court ordered them not to contact you. Ever? For a very long time. When you are older, you will still have the right to decide who belongs in your life. Lark looked at the sound map again. Then she drew a green line across the doorway. What is that? I asked. Me deciding if it opens. I nodded. Yes. For the first time, the door in one of Lark's drawings did not belong to the person trying to enter. It belonged to her. On July 17th, 9 months after the crash and 3 months after the sentencing hearings, I woke at 2:14 inches the morning because Lark's room had gone quiet. There was nothing unusual about the silence. The air conditioner hummed through the vents. Rain tapped lightly against the upstairs windows. Somewhere outside, a car moved across the wet street and faded into the distance. Still, I left my bed. Lark slept with her door open 6 inches. She said she needed to hear the house before she could trust it. Every night, she asked whether the front door was locked, whether the back window was closed, and whether anyone else had a key. I answered every question. Then I checked again after she fell asleep. That night, I stood in the narrow opening and watched the blanket rise over her chest. Up, down, up, down. Her breathing was quiet and even. I remained there until she opened her eyes. Mom? I'm sorry. Go back to sleep. Were you checking? I could have lied. Instead, I nodded. Lark moved onto her back and looked at the ceiling. I'm breathing. I know. You check a lot. I do. Because Aunt took the tube? The question was calm, which somehow made it harder to answer. Yes. She reached toward the lamp, but stopped before touching it. Do you want the light on? I asked. No. I waited. You can go back to bed, she said. I knew she was not rejecting me. She was asking me to trust the safety we had built. So I returned to my room. I did not sleep again. Healing had not arrived when the judge imposed 18 years on Odette and 11 years on Corinne. It had not entered our house the day Lark came home from rehabilitation. It did not move in a straight line from fear toward peace. Some mornings, Lark walked into the kitchen laughing because the toaster sounded like a tiny door slamming. Other mornings, the microwave beep made her drop a glass. She could sit through an entire therapy session discussing the crash, then panic because I reached past her to adjust the collar of her shirt. She no longer needed oxygen. Her neurological tests continued to improve. Her balance had almost returned, and her teachers said her concentration was growing stronger each week. Yet she still froze when anyone stood behind her. I still watched her breathe at night. We attended therapy separately and together. My therapist asked me to describe the second before Corinne caught my wrists. I told her about Odette's hand reaching toward the tube. She asked what I felt in my body when I remembered it. I told her I felt nothing. The following week, I admitted that was not true. My shoulders locked. My fingers went numb. My lungs stopped halfway through a breath, as if my body still believed Corinne's hands were behind me. Lark's therapist did not tell her to be brave. She taught her to name what belonged to the present. My feet are on the floor. The door is open. Mom is beside me. I am breathing by myself. Sometimes Lark said the sentences aloud. Sometimes she only pointed to the red, yellow, or green cards we still kept around the house. I learned not to treat a green day as victory or a red day as failure. Both were information. The letters began arriving in May. They came from relatives who had remained silent during the court hearings and suddenly found their voices after the sentences became final. Aunt Meredith wrote that Corinne had already lost her freedom and reputation. She said 11 years was more punishment than any grandmother could survive. A cousin wrote that Odette would be nearly 60 when she left prison, and asked whether one terrible decision should erase an entire life. Another relative said the family needed to begin healing, and suggested that I allow supervised letters to Lark. None of them described what they were apologizing for. None mentioned that Lark had waited 7 minutes for a stranger to call 911. None mentioned the breathing tube. They wrote about time served, public shame, lost holidays, and birthdays behind glass. They wrote as though consequences had turned Corinne and Odette into the most injured people in the story. I stored every letter in a locked file box because Leah told me to preserve attempts at indirect contact. The protective orders prohibited messages sent through relatives, but proving a violation required records. I did not show the letters to Lark. That decision was not secrecy. It was custody. The words belonged to adults trying to move responsibility again. Lark could decide when she was older whether she wanted to read them. Until then, I would not place their guilt in her room and call it honesty. One envelope was different. It came from my cousin Sylvia, who had once texted that exhaustion had distorted what I saw in the ICU. Her letter was 1 page. She did not explain what Corinne had told her. She did not blame panic, grief, or family pressure. She wrote that she had repeated a story because believing it was easier than asking whether Lark was safe. She apologized for calling me unstable and for discussing Lark's memory as though it belonged to the family. The last paragraph said she understood that an apology did not create a right to contact us. I read the letter twice. Then I wrote back. I told Sylvia I accepted the apology. I also told her the boundary remained. She would not visit Lark, call her, send gifts, or ask another relative to carry a message. Accountability could begin a change. It could not purchase entry into my daughter's life. Sylvia answered with 2 sentences. I understand. I will respect it. She did. That mattered more than any emotional promise. In July, Lark asked to return to the after-school sound workshop at her old school. The workshop met in the same building where Odette had signed her out on the day of the crash. When Lark first mentioned it, I thought I had misunderstood. You want to go back there? Yes. You do not have to prove anything. I'm not proving. She sat at the kitchen table, sharpening a blue pencil. I missed the good sounds. The teacher, Miss Alvarez, arranged a gradual return. Lark could attend for 30 minutes, leave whenever she wanted, and choose any seat in the room. Before the first class, we stood in the hallway outside the gym entrance. The same electronic kiosk waited beside the door. Lark looked at it for several seconds. Do you want to go home? I asked. Yellow. We waited. Students passed around us carrying notebooks and water bottles. Nobody stared for long. The school had told families only that Lark had been recovering from a serious accident. Miss Alvarez opened the classroom door. You can sit anywhere, she told Lark. A chair near the exit remained empty. Another sat beside the windows. Several students had already gathered around the center tables. Lark chose the chair near the door. No one praised her for entering. No one suggested that the center seat would be braver. Miss Alvarez handed out the assignment. Create a sound map of a place where you feel safe. Lark opened her notebook, but did not draw immediately. She listened. Pencils moved across paper. The air conditioner clicked on. Someone's shoe tapped twice against a chair leg. A student unzipped a backpack. Lark began marking the sounds. Gray lines for the pencils. A pale blue square for the air conditioner. Small brown dots for footsteps near the door. I sat in the hallway where she could see me through the window if she turned her head. After 20 minutes, a delivery truck stopped outside. Its reverse alarm sounded 3 sharp beeps. Lark's pencil fell. Her shoulders rose, and one hand moved toward her throat. I started to stand. Mrs. Alvarez did not touch her. She crouched several feet away and asked, red, yellow, or green? Lark lifted the yellow card from her desk. The truck beeped again. She placed both feet on the floor. I watched her lips move. My feet are on the floor. The door is open. Mom is outside. I am breathing by myself. The alarm stopped. Miss Alvarez asked whether she wanted to leave. Lark looked at the door. Then she looked down at the unfinished map. Green, she said. She picked up the pencil. She added 3 red marks near the edge of the page, not hiding the warning sound and not allowing it to take over the whole picture. When class ended, she came into the hallway carrying the notebook against her chest. You stayed, I said. I chose to. Yes, that's different. It was. Staying because an adult would become angry was not courage. Staying because she had evaluated the danger and chosen for herself was control. On the drive home, we stopped at a red light near the pharmacy. Lark noticed the building before I did. Her body became still. I did not ask whether she remembered Corinne taking the medication or Odette handing over the keys. I waited. Can we keep going? She asked. Yes. When the light changed, I drove straight through. At home, she placed the sound map on the kitchen counter. Are the 6 words why Dr. Nadim called the police? The question came while I was filling the kettle. I turned off the faucet. They helped her understand that the crash and the ICU were connected. So, she called because I said them. She called because your words showed that there might be another crime and that Odette had just tried to stop a witness from speaking. Lark looked down at the map. If I didn't say them? The hospital had already reported what Odette did. The ventilator had recorded the tube coming out. The nurses saw where everyone was. My wrists were photographed. But the crash? The police found video, vehicle records, medical evidence, phone data, and the witness who called 911. Because I told them where to look. You helped them look again. She traced one finger over the 3 red warning marks. What if I remember it differently someday? Then you tell the truth as you remember it that day. Their choices existed before your words, and the evidence did not depend on you remembering everything perfectly. What if I had stayed quiet? They still would have done those things. Maybe nobody would know. Not knowing is not the same as nothing happening. The kettle began to hum. Lark looked toward it. Did you wish I said more? I thought of the first months after the crash, when every new memory felt like a piece of evidence I needed to protect. At first, I wanted every answer, I said. I wanted a perfect story because I was afraid people would not believe us without one. Did they? Some people did not want to believe, but the truth did not need you to remember everything perfectly. She nodded slowly. I reached for the kettle, then stopped before standing. There is something I need to say again. You already said sorry. I know. I only want you to know what changed. You never needed the perfect word. I learned to ask. Lark watched me. I didn't know the word unsafe. You did not need the word. You asked later. Yes. And I told you. Yes. You believed me. The kettle clicked off. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then Lark slid the sound map toward me. Can we finish this one at home? The assignment had been to map one safe place. Lark decided a safe place did not need to be a single room. She carried the notebook through the house over the next 2 days. In the kitchen, she drew orange loops for the kettle warming. At my desk, she marked the soft scratch of my pen with thin gray lines. Near the living room window, she added blue dots for summer rain. She recorded the front lock turning once at night and once in the morning. The first sound meant the house was secured. The second meant she had chosen to open it. She included the refrigerator, the floorboards, and the washing machine shifting during its final cycle. Then she sat beside the window and listened to herself breathe. Months earlier, every sound map that included breathing had used red. Red for the ventilator, red for alarms, red for the feeling of hands deciding whether air could reach her. This time, Lark selected an ordinary black pencil. She drew 2 small curved lines, one for breathing in, one for breathing out. She did not circle them. She did not place a warning mark beside them. I stood behind the kitchen counter, far enough away that she controlled the space around her. That looks finished, I said. Almost. She added one final mark beside the window. What sound is that? You asking. Asking what? Where I want it. I smiled, but did not tell her she was strong. Strength had been demanded from her too many times by people who wanted her to endure what they refused to stop. Where do you want to hang it? I asked. Lark carried the map through the living room. She considered the wall near the front door, then the hallway outside her bedroom. Finally, she chose the space beside the window, where the afternoon light reached the paper. There. I held the frame while she marked the position with a pencil. Then I drove in the hook and let her place the map herself. She stepped back to examine it. The kettle, my pen, the rain, the lock, her breathing. None of the sounds belonged to a hospital. None had been recorded by a machine designed to prove what someone had done. They belonged to her because she had chosen to hear them. Lark turned and wrapped both arms around me. The hug came without warning, but I did not tense. Her head rested beneath my chin. Then she said 6 words. You believed me. That saved me. I closed my eyes. In the ICU, saving Lark had meant reaching for a bed while Corinne held me back. It had meant doctors forcing air into injured lungs after Odette tried to take it away. But survival had not ended when the monitor stabilized. Saving her also meant refusing to let relatives rename the truth. It meant accepting that her memory could be incomplete without becoming worthless. It meant giving her control over who touched her, who entered her room, and which questions she answered. It meant understanding that belief was not ownership. I did not own her words because I believed them. I was responsible for protecting her right to speak them. Lark released me and returned to the window. Rain moved softly against the glass. She picked up her pencil and listened. Then she drew the final sound. Before placing the mark, she took one slow breath. No machine measured it. No alarm followed. No hands held me back. No one stood beside her deciding whether her life, her memory, or her voice was worth protecting. Lark breathed in, because she chose to. Then she breathed out, and made the sound her own.